Thank you. I'd like to call this special meeting of the Board of Education to order. The next Board of Education meeting is on Tuesday, August 27th at 7:30 p.m. First, I'd like to thank everyone for being here this morning. We have a long day in front of us, so thank you to all the administrative staff for all the work they've done to prepare for it, and to the board members who've agreed to spend the day here. And thank you also to members of the public who will be engaging with us in person or online. Secondly, I had an opportunity to attend the Kids in Crisis Summit yesterday. Our thanks to Dr. Adley and the team who helped organize that. We were the host at Oxridge School. It was hosted in the cafeteria. It was truly a beautiful setting for the event. And of course, it was a fantastic opportunity to hear a little bit more about the expansion of Kids in Crisis, about the Kids in Crisis in our high school and the expansion into the middle school. Of course, we thank the Community Fund again for their support with that, and to hear a little bit more from other schools who use Kids in Crisis, as well as organizations who fund it, and other boards and superintendents. Okay. Lastly, we'd like to thank the OA for the Day folks for their engagement around the topic of personal devices in schools. As a board, we share the commitment to the impact of personal devices on the mental health and the educational experience of our children. We all sit here as first and foremost as parents, secondly as community members, and thirdly, of course, as board members. In our board member capacity, we have a lot of ability to affect what happens in the school day, but we strongly, or I at least strongly feel that the school day is only a portion of this entire discussion. So I'm grateful to see parents up and mobilized, because this would have to be a large community scale exercise. It is critical that we as parents make the right choices for our kids. If we don't want them to have devices, it is so hard. Believe me, I am currently the worst mom in town on a regular, but it's important. So I think we have to stand together. And so I look forward to hearing more about what is happening in schools with administration today. I look forward to hearing from some parents, and I really look forward to a community level discussion about the choices we all make in our homes, in community organizations, and in our schools. Thank you so much. With that, I'll turn it to public comment.
Good morning. If anyone in person would like to participate in public comment, please come up to the podium and wait for the chair to recognize you. Please state your name and address for the record, and you will have up to 3 minutes to comment. Please note the time with the chair.
Okay, good morning. I'm Susan Shannon. I live in Darien on Gardner Street. I'm a graduate of Darien Schools. I have had the privilege of teaching at Middlesex Middle School for the last 15 years. And I enjoy it so much. I'm here representing fellow teachers and parents that I've talked to who are unable to attend this meeting. I want to talk about the scheduled update of the use of personal devices. I know we've all read about the frequency of disruptions in cell phone use, how students are distracted, and how it leads to frustration, students feeling left out, feeling guilty and frustrated. We also have known what the Surgeon General has said about cell phones, but I know all of us have seen where kids are sitting right next to their friends, and instead of talking, they're texting each other. I know we've seen that firsthand. I was surprised that in the school year of 2021 to 2022, more than 75% of public schools have banned cell phone use, according to the National Center for Education Statistics. Last year, Florida was the first state to require public schools to ban it, followed by Indiana. Connecticut is one of those considering it. Darien prides itself on being the first and putting students first and their well-being. I just want to personally say that I've had a cell phone of students go off during class because the student had the phone in their pocket. I thought it must be something important, because why else would a parent be calling a child in the middle of the day? The student answered the phone, and it was their parent telling them that they had just dropped off their forgotten lunch. The student was so embarrassed. Even the kids walking out of the classroom, even throughout the day in the hall, you could hear them talking about the child. Oh, your parent called you. And I know, I felt sorry for the student. And also, I'm sure the parent had no idea how they embarrassed their child so much. Another personal experience I've had is I give assessments, I teach math. I give assessments out at the very end of class just for the children's sake. I feel it's important. Their score is just between them, myself, and the parents. And a student had received an 84 and was upset. And it was usually lower than usual. So I had written a little note on the test, please come see me after class. But instead of coming and popping in just to see me and talk about it, they went to their locker, texted their parent, and said they were failing math. The student went on to have a snowball day of being very upset. Things were not working out for the poor child. And instead of seeing me and working it out and saying, let's see what we could do to improve next time. Oops, am I?
You're at
Okay,
time.
sorry.
Yeah. If you just
But
want to quickly
thank you for your
summarize.
attention to what I have, and I hope you take it into consideration. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for speaking. Okay.
Morning, I'm Mary Connell Lifton, 180 Middlesex Road. And thanks, Jill, for your introduction. I couldn't agree more about parent participation. And I'd like to thank the entire board for adding to today's agenda, discussion, and hopefully a vote on a smartphone and device policy for Darien schools, and for taking the time to read the letters that we've submitted on this topic, including the most recent, which was submitted just last Friday on behalf of close to 500 Darien families. And I'd like to emphasize that this letter now has close to 600 signatures representing Darien families and close to 1,300 school children in our district. And we're going to continue to circulate this letter. And I want to note that it's the dead middle of the summer. People are at the pool, they're on vacation, and yet they've taken the time to sign this, to forward to concerned friends and colleagues. And over 180 people indicated their intention to join us online and in person. There was a time change. It's not 180. You all can rest easy. But people care about this. Taking times out of their days, again, in the middle of summer, to show up and implore the board to get phones out of our schools. We're aware that the administration is looking to implement a policy, and I say this between quotes, for kindergarten to 8th grade. Unfortunately, simply sending a clear message that kids should put their phones in their lockers at middle school and shouldn't bring them to elementary school is not a policy. This is what esteemed NYU social psychologist and thought leader on this topic, Jonathan Haidt, calls an unenforceable wish. We're here today begging the board to pass a resolution directing the administration to implement with all due haste, not a year from now, not after further study, but as soon as possible, a policy that prohibits phones at the elementary school and puts phones in a secure location until the last bell has rung at both the middle school and the high school. And the policy needs to include serious consequences for violations. We cannot simply trust our kids to do the right thing. That is asking too much of them. It's like asking an alcoholic to keep a bottle in his locker and just don't open it during the day. We know how hard it is for us as adults to put our phones down. Check your settings. How many pickups do you have since it's not even 10 a.m.? How can we ask kids not to go to the bathroom and sneak a check of their Instagram notifications or see if there's a new text message? It is not fair to put this responsibility on them or on our teachers for having to enforce such a non-policy. And I know there's teachers here today, and I thank you for your comment, and I hope for other teachers will speak up about their own frustrations with phones and devices. The proposed policy does not fundamentally alter the policy, and again, I use quotes, that is in place today, and we can tell you it's not working. We've heard from one teacher, you can hear from parents, it's not working. Kids are on phones at lunch, between classes, during study hall, watches buzz, phones ring, and all this takes away from the business of educating our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Connell.
Hi, everyone. Kate Gregory, 15 Winding Lane. And real quick, this is my second time here. And it was hard to carve out the time. So I really appreciate that you all do that so much. And we do appreciate that. Okay, you're going to hear from other speakers today and who will talk about the research that makes abundantly clear why this policy needs to include the high school. But in short, these are our most vulnerable students. 100% of them have phones and close to 100% of them are on social media. Probably the most nefarious aspect of smart technology, certainly for children under 18. Again, Jonathan Haidt. And you will hear from speakers that explain why the policy needs to be enforced bell to bell. But again, in short, it's not just the distraction that phones present during class time. These children need to talk to each other between classes and at lunchtime and not be hunched over their phones and catching up on TikTok and Instagram notifications. They need to engage, socialize with eye contact, and develop these social skills that are sorely lacking in children today. This district is one salacious video captured in the bathroom, one incident in a classroom caught on video, one student harming himself away from disaster. We're aware that we have a mental health crisis and you're ignoring the easiest, fastest, and cheapest way to address this crisis. But I'm not here to tell you that the sky is falling. We don't think it is. You'll also hear about solutions, task force, toolkits. The work has been done here. We don't have to reinvent the wheel in Darien. This wonderful teacher just cited a lot of the districts that have already implemented this. We have a template. We can suggest appropriate consequences, communications for the rollout. All of this exists through work that's already been done at nonprofits and has been focused on this issue for years. We believe that a rational policy can be implemented in short order, and over 600 families in the district agree. This is going to happen nationally and right here in Connecticut. We know from the news there's momentum here and in Darien, and we should not be the last district in Fairfield County to act on this. We should be the leaders. This is happening in LA, New York, Virginia, Ohio. Governors are taking action, school boards are taking action, including our peer districts like Weston and Wilton. Let's not wait and see what they do. Let's enact a policy and work collaboratively with them to see what's working and what's not so we can tweak and adapt, but let's not wait until we think we have every possible issue solved before we move. First of all, it's impossible to anticipate every challenge, but more importantly, it is not fair to our children who are suffering with each semester that we allow this to continue. I'll conclude with a powerful analogy we heard recently at another Board of Ed meeting regarding asbestos. In the 50s, this was a cheap, revolutionary new material, strong and impervious. It seemed to have revolutionized the construction industry. But then it was discovered it was also toxic. What happened? Lawmakers stepped in and demanded the owners of buildings abate this toxic material. Students were required by law to remove asbestos. The analogy to smart devices is clear. Here is the amazing new technology that had the potential to revolutionize the education space, and there are certainly positive aspects to it. But it has been revealed to be toxic in the hands of children. And you, our elected officials, now need to step in to abate this toxin in our schools. Lucky for you, this cost is free. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Morning. My printer broke, so I understand the irony of me coming up here and reading off my phone, but here we are. My name is Mary Nevin Gauthier. I have been a resident of Darien since 2019, and my children will be going into 1st and 3rd grade at Tokenique Elementary. I prioritized being here this morning because I support a K through 12 bell-to-bell policy in our schools and would like to see this implemented this fall. To be clear, from my perspective, this request is not a moralistic one. It is not my intention to police my neighbors or to tell anyone what their family's relationship with smartphones should look like. This is simply about what the research shows and how the school can build a responsible policy collectively with the community around this evidence. A bell-to-bell policy is needed because both research and our own experience shows that simply knowing better is not enough to effectively change, whether that's around smartphones or other ways. I'll tell a slightly embarrassing story from my own life. I have the privilege of being on the RTM. I chose it. I think it's so important and I see the value in it every time. When I have my phone with me at the RTM, some of you have sat behind me in these meetings. I get notifications. It's usually my husband saying, what lunchbox, someone's lost their backpack, where's the stuffy, or just a friend coordinating a play date for tomorrow. I pick it up. It's not urgent. I read it. I've read all the RTM materials, but do you think that I'm as effectively prepared to speak on, vote, understand what's being discussed if I'm distracted on my phone? No. To be honest, on my committee, I've volunteered to clerk because that's a procedure that I can monitor myself with a hopefully fully developed prefrontal cortex. But I'm 38 years old. I'm an adult. I like to think that I'm pretty responsible and monitor my own phone use. And yet these are measures that I put in place for a volunteer commitment that I've signed up for to make sure that I am showing up as my best self and not distracted by this device that I use. A bell-to-bell ban will simplify things from a policy perspective to make school more harmonious and educationally sound. Additionally, it will allow each family the complete freedom to define and, more importantly, model their own relationship with technology within the home. So I ask the Board of Education, on behalf of the children of Darien, to please institute a K through 12 bell-to-bell policy and a smart device ban in Darien schools. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you tell me your name one more time for the
That was
minutes?
a long one. Yeah, Mary Nevin Gautier.
Maybe you could spell for me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I've got the, yeah.
It's somebody. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Morning, everybody. My name's Tyler Lifton. I live at 180 Middlesex Road. I didn't get a chance to read through this ahead of time, so if I have to read the whole thing, just bear with me. Jonathan Haidt, I think you probably all know the name. He's an NYU social psychologist and a leader in our fight to get smartphones and other smart devices out of our schools. He outlines 4 pillars in his recent book, The Anxious Generation, 4 pillars to improve the mental health crisis our children are currently experiencing. He calls for collective action, which is something that Jill referenced a bit earlier, collective action to help the current situation, and proposes 4 clear steps that parents, schools, technology companies, and governments can take. Number 1, no smartphones before high school, meaning don't get your kids a smartphone before high school. This is what he lays out. To be clear, he's not suggesting that once they do get it, they can then bring it to high school. But not getting it before high school in some ways seems radical in the current environment. But in a lot of ways, if you take a step back, it's really a practical compromise, considering the fact that girls' frontal cortexes are not fully formed until the age of 21, boys until the age of 25. And here we are getting them smartphones at the age of 9, 10, 11. It's really quite something when you think about it for a moment. Number 2, no social media before the age of 16. Again, Jonathan Haidt, who's studied quite a bit of this, would probably prefer 25 or later, but the suggestion is 16. Think about how many kids in this town get social media well before that. 3, and this is the key for us today, phone-free schools. 3, getting phones out of schools, all schools, not just K through 8. In fact, he tells us that our high school students, and this is really important because I know there's been talk about policies for K through 8 versus high school. Our high school students are the most critical cohort because they're the ones that are most addicted to their phones. And finally, far more independence and free play. This is number 4. Getting phones out of schools will help with that. Think about recess, think about lunch, think about free periods. Let's give children the chance to interact with one another, not with their phones, with one another. Let them learn these important skills that we all take for granted because we had the chance to develop them as children. And it's been so critical to everything that we do in our entire lives. Let's give our children the chance to develop the skills that we, sitting in this room, take for granted. Let's give them the chance to develop social development that were once common and taken for granted and really is now sorely lacking amongst our children. So let's please enact a phone and smartphone device ban K through 12 now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kate DeRocher. I live at 12 Partridge Lane. I have 1 child in the Darien school system. She will be in 9th grade this fall. So thank you for giving me an opportunity. I wanted to provide public comments in my support of banning smartphones in the school, both K through 8, but also in the high school. I think it's especially important that we ban them in the high school. And there are a number of reasons. One, I want to support teachers. I think that they deserve a work environment that's free of distractions from kids, even though the best intention to have kids put the phone away, as we heard, doesn't always happen. I also think we need to continue to support the mental health needs of our students. And we as a community have done a tremendous job up until this point, implementing social and emotional learning and especially in the last few years, supporting their mental health. It seems counterproductive to me that we would allow the phones to be in the schools when so much of the research is coming out, especially in high schools, that it's detrimental to our students. And then lastly, I think we have an opportunity to give our kids some of the freedom that we had as kids. And I think probably all of us have had that moment where we've wished that smartphones weren't around, or we're thankful that smartphones weren't around when we were as kids, not documenting all of the embarrassing things that we've done. I think that we have this opportunity to give it back to our kids. I have chaperoned some of the middle school dances, and I expected them to be a little embarrassing for the kids or a little cringy. And what I found was the kids didn't even dance. They weren't interacting with each other. I mean, I asked some of the girls that I knew are dancers and I would normally have expected them to dance why that was. And they said part of the reason is they didn't want kids to film it. They didn't want, they didn't want to have it on the smartphone that they might be embarrassed. And I've heard this echoed from other high school parents, kids not getting involved because they don't want to risk somebody pulling out a phone and embarrassing them later. And I don't don't think that we can put the genie back in the bottle, right? I know that smartphones are here. It's our responsibility as parents to decide how often we give them to our kids, when to delay, when to give social media. But I think we have a unique opportunity right now to put the genie back in the bottle during school hours and allow our kids to be kids. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Morning. My name is Sarah Walker. I live at 11 Contentment Island, and I have 3 kids in the Darien schools, an elementary school student, a middle school student, and an upcoming high school student. Thank you all, first of all, for your service. I know that this is really hard work, so I appreciate your service. We've seen the alarming research. You've all seen it, and clearly smartphones are a war that has to be fought mostly by parents outside of school. But the problem is clearly within our schools in Darien. I've seen it at MMS, where even the great students are texting throughout the day. Mom, can you make me a haircut appointment? Mom, is baseball canceled for rain? Mom, can Susie sleep over next weekend? Innocent, but they're very distracted. I also, wanting to know more about the high school situation, asked some post 53 kids what it's like at the high school. They related to me that though most kids are very focused in class, fortunately, that there are a significant number, perhaps 20% these kids thought, who were frequently in the back of the class on devices, mostly gaming. So the problem is in our schools, and it's impacting our children. I support a total ban, K through 12, for a few reasons. First of all, it's clear that phones are seriously detrimental to learning and children's development, and schools are a special environment that should be protected. We've got to protect the children and teacher unique relationship and the critical learning purpose that goes on. Second, I feel that a partial ban will just not work. It won't achieve the goal of protecting the focus of the children, optimizing learning environment, and it would be a nightmare to police for administrators and teachers. We don't want that. A total ban, though it seems more draconian, will ultimately be simpler to operationalize and will get better results for students. It won't be easy, I understand that. Parents will be inconvenienced. After school plans will be harder to change. We won't be able to check in on our children, but it is worth it. And I believe that if the board and our educational leaders make it clear how very important this is, that parents will all adjust and eventually will appreciate your prioritization of our children's development. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else in person? If anybody online would like to participate in public comment, please use the raised hand icon. We have no raised hands at this time.
Oh, one.
Oh, all right, she didn't use the icon. I apologize for that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mrs. Hennemuth, you are recognized.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Rachel Hennemuth and I live at 39 Millwood Lane. I have 3 children, ages 13, 14, and 16. I'm going to focus my comments on the high school years. My oldest will be a junior at DHS this year and my middle son will be a freshman. I love the high school for so many reasons, but in my opinion, the freedom to use your phones at school is a huge problem. The amount of time my son is on his phone during school hours doing non-school related things is shocking to me. Some days it's over 2 hours. It seems he spends his entire lunch and much of his free periods on social media or playing video games with friends. I've talked with many friends with high school students. I know his behavior is not unusual. I've also heard from teachers that it is a giant problem in classrooms. It is not fair to ask teachers to police phones when the school doesn't have a firm policy on it. Phones get in the way of kids learning and is just a huge distraction overall. I also admit I was guilty of texting my kids during school hours. I think of something I need to remind them of and just lob a text. I then went to Max Stossel's talk, and after that, I really started to make a concerted effort to stop this. I realized so much of what I was texting them could wait. I told my kids to stop texting me unless it was an emergency. They kept texting me. Eventually, I stopped responding out of habit. And I found that writing back to them was just reinforcing the behavior. Parenting experts and abundant research tells us kids' resilience and self-confidence grows when they learn to solve problems on their own. Of course, I want to be there for my kids, but if I'm doing the solving for them, they never get a chance to try to do this independently. Like so many of you out there, I'm just trying to do my best as a parent, and this advice makes so much sense to me. One final quick story. Recently, I got together with some friends and their kids who went away to Jamaica in June as part of a service project with the church. The kids' cell phones were taken.
Whoop, we lost sound. Ms. Henmuth, would you pause for a second? We've lost sound.
She has to unmute herself.
Oh, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
We got you back. Okay, please continue.
Okay, so the kids had their cell phones taken away. These high school students told me how nice it ended up being not to have their phones this week, and they didn't have to deal with them. They felt they bonded so much more with the other kids on the trip. The bus rides were so much more fun. They played tons of card games. One girl even told me before the trip she would have been very against getting phones out of school. But after this experience, she'd be far less resistant to it, and even said to me that she thinks lunch would be so much more fun if kids didn't have their phones. Again, I know this is not an unusual story. Talk to any parent whose kids have been to sleepaway camps recently. They come home lighter and more engaged in conversations, and maybe even admit how nice it was to have a break from their phone. And I don't need to remind you that every adult in this room, or nearly all of their school years, went through school without the mobile phone. It's no mental stretch to answer the question.
Can you just conclude? You're at time.
Sorry. She needs to unmute.
You have to unmute again.
Okay. We are also used to having 24/7 access to our kids, and the kids are accustomed to having their moms in their pockets at all times. But the simple fact is they don't need their phones in schools. Are there going to be some exceptions to this? Sure. Are there going to be people who are against this change? Absolutely. Is this change going to be hard at first? Definitely, but it's worth doing. Please institute a K-12 bell-to-bell phone ban. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else cast?
We do not have any raised hands icons. Oh, wait, Kate, sorry. Mrs. Coyle, you've been recognized.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Kate Coyle. I have 3 children who are 11, and 8 in the Darien public school systems. One's rising 6th grader, and I'm very anxious about them having access to schools to phones during school and supportive of a K-12 bell-to-bell, completely smartphone, smart device-free environment in the Darien public school systems. The author, Jonathan Haidt, who's been previously quoted today, the author of The Anxious Generation, notes that phone bans ameliorate 3 of the 4 foundational harms of the phone-based childhood: attention fragmentation, social deprivation, and addiction. It reduces social comparison and the pull into the virtual world, and it generates communion and community. The use of phones in classrooms and the draw to participate in these virtual devices, hiding behind school books, grabbing them between classrooms, creates a zombie apocalypse type environment. And it goes down to even young children who have access to devices. I've seen it firsthand with my own children, if they're ever even granted access to a device. I think that the whole concept of policing phones in schools is a very difficult concept. And in lieu of actually policing it and saying that you're like creating a ban in the school, I think it actually has to be an actual device-free environment where phones are put away, locked away, and not even provided with like temporary access between classrooms at all, like a bell-to-bell, completely phone-free and smartphone device-free environment, I think is the best support that we can provide to our children in this generation. I think that the data will continue to grow to support that the rates of loneliness will continue to increase if we don't act now, and there'll just be greater impact to our children. We have an opportunity to act now, and I implore the Board of Ed to make this free decision to improve the school environment and reduce the virtual pull for our children. Having a phone ban for all of our children, not just the youngest, but middle school and high school, a K through 12 bell-to-bell phone and device-free environment in our Darien public school system is the best way to do that. And I hope that you make the right decision in this choice. And I thank you for your consideration. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate.
Mrs. Coyle, sorry, I was trying to get her address for you. I
Kate
apologize.
Coyle.
Oh, sure. Kate Coyle, 3 Searles Road.
3 Searles Road. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. And MC.
We now have no more raised hand icons.
Okay. With that, I'll move on to, thank you all. I'll move on to legal updates and board operations. Thank you, Tom, for being here today. All right.
What's up?
Yeah, I get it. I will not take it personally that the room clears out when
Yeah,
the topic is legal update.
please don't.
Well, thank Mr. Mooney for being here this morning. And as you know, our legal counsel, on an annual basis, he makes time to get to come and speak to the board to update on legal issues and have an opportunity to ask any questions or otherwise that you might have. Thank you, Con, for being with us this morning. Appreciate it. Are these on?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, fire away, Tom. I think we have about an hour.
Yeah, my understanding
20.
is that 10:30 is your next
Yes.
agenda item.
Yes.
And it would be my plan to go through the new legislation for about an hour, maybe a little less. And then I have, as I like to do, 3 scenarios for your discussion consideration. And I'm particularly excited about one that I wrote just for you.
Okay, great.
But before we get to the scenarios, I would like to just walk through some of the new legislation. And do you all have now a hard copy of the
Yes.
update? Alan will be making this available to you
We received it last
online.
night.
Is okay. And so for the intellectually curious, you can go and click on the individual statutes and read the actual language and see if I captured the meaning of the legislation. The first act that I'd like to talk about has a number of different elements. The first of which, in Public Act 2441, deals with educator certification and the current regulations. As you know, you cannot teach in the public schools unless you're certified. And that's like the gatekeeper. And the current regulations were written in 1998. And in the early 2000s, they thought about changing the regulations and they didn't. And we are continuing to work with regulations that were written all those many years ago. And so the thought here is to take a new look at the regulations to make them more appropriate provide more flexibility. If you'll indulge me in a personal anecdote, my wife, now retired, was a teacher for many years, and she taught for 10 years in the public schools in Connecticut. She stayed home with our kids for some years and did not send in her check. So her certification lapsed. So in order to return to the profession, she had to reapply. And although she was teaching biology, has a master's in public health from Yale, the Certification Bureau ruled that she was unqualified to teach because she had too few hours of student teaching back in the early 70s. And we had to stand on our head to get through that. But that's the nature of the inflexibility that the current regulations present. And as you know, there's a shortage of qualified teachers. And so the purpose here of this review is to take a fresh look and make these regulations more logical and more sensible. And so there's this new entity created, the Connecticut Educator Preparation and Certification Board, and there are 16 members. And as you see on the bottom of page 1, their charge is to develop standards and proposals for regulations or legislation relating to educator preparation and certification. And then you see, I won't go through all of it, but the purpose here is to build streamlined, flexible pathways that are grounded in a commitment to educator effectiveness, and on and on. So let's hope. I am an optimist by nature. So I hope that after these many years, this new entity will take a meaningful look at the certification process and make meaningful changes in teacher certification. As you'll see throughout the legislation, there's the General Assembly likes to create entities and likes to get reports. And this new entity has to provide an annual report that includes a detailed summary of the substance and disposition of any standards and proposals. Interestingly, you have on the one hand the State Board of Ed, which has sat on its hands for 20 plus years, and you have this new entity. And the law provides a default assumption, and that is that either entity can propose regulations, and if the other side, the other entity doesn't object, then they go into effect. And if either entity proposes legislation, that legislation goes to the Education Committee for consideration. I do welcome questions as we're going along, so don't hesitate if I have any questions. Mr. Sini.
Thanks, Tom. Did this get support from the unions?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the struggle, as I understand it anecdotally, was to not just throw certification out because, you know, it's a balance. You want to have some rigor and you want to make sure that the people who teach the children are qualified, but those qualifications have to be meaningful. And the push was almost to like say, well, open the door, let's expand the pool by lowering our standards. And instead we have this new procedural approach, which I think is very helpful. The next one is just mechanical. The legislature has focused in many different ways on paraeducators. And just speaking from experience, that profession has changed dramatically. It used to be like a part-time job and a little extra money. And now the role of paraeducators in our schools is crucial. And there's different legislative initiatives to enhance the profession. Last year, or perhaps the year before, the General Assembly requires now that paraeducators get 18 hours of professional development each year. The new legislation here on FMLA reflects a action that the General Assembly took with regard to FMLA. As you may know, the FMLA is the Family Medical and Leave Act, federal law that applies to public schools. And to be entitled to up to 12 weeks of leave in a given year, you have to work 1,250 hours. That cut out paraprofessionals and other district employees. And so as a matter of public policy, the General Assembly felt it appropriate to extend that opportunity for leave to paraeducators, which they did a couple years ago. And now this new law extends that entitlement to FMLA benefits to any non-certified Board of Education employee if they work at least 950 hours, not the 1,250. And you'll see the next bullet is that I'm sorry.
I was going to have Marge interpret that for our specific district. So, because we have two different, we use instructional aides and paraprofessionals, and whether or not this makes any difference to.
No, we've been applying the law that way to paraprofessionals, paraeducators for a while.
Yes.
Okay.
And now any non-certified employee of a Board of Ed would have that entitlement to FMLA.
Okay.
With the lower threshold of
Okay.
hours.
And-
But over the years, different places of when I started, it was teacher aides, then paraeducators, and so on. And now the preferred term, and they went through and changed all the statutes, is paraeducator.
Okay.
So that's.
So will we use that term for both classes of employee that they're not classes is the wrong word, but we've used the term instructional aid and we've used the term paraprofessional usually to refer to it specifically.
I think that would be great if we just referred to everyone as a paraeducator.
As a paraeducator. Okay. We'll just have to figure out how to distinguish when we budget. Okay, thank you. Excuse me.
And the next is a mechanical requirement. For many years, parents have been entitled to a notice of all of the rights that they have when their children are receiving special education services. And the law required that they be provided at PPT meetings. The new law says that when you give a notice of a PPT, you have to send the notice of rights. There are some significant changes in the DCF reporting statutes. We'll start with just the premise. And the premise is that there's this very easy trigger for a mandated reporter. Anytime a mandated reporter, and by the way, I've had this question, board members are not mandated reporters, but pretty much everyone else is. Whenever a mandated reporter has reasonable cause to suspect or believe that a child has been neglected, abused, or put at risk, they must report to DCF. Where people have had trouble is when they don't do it that way, because DCF is the lead agency for investigations, and mandated reporters could get in trouble if they start looking into it. They just, and it's particularly hard if you're a teacher and there's some child makes a complaint about a colleague. I mean, that's hard. And sometimes teachers would, well, tell me more about it, and so on and so forth. And that was contrary to the law. The law said you report and let DCF handle it. DCF is the lead agency. So in some circumstances, we work with DCF to get them to, or to coordinate our investigations, because the statutes continue to provide that we, the board, has an independent obligation to investigate. Long story short, there's this new concept in the law called a preliminary inquiry. And so because, well, as you may know, because of the problems I've just described, educators were arrested. There were headlines, even a superintendent was arrested. And the consequence, that was about 5 years ago. And so the consequence was DCF was flooded with reports because the thought was, well, I don't want to get arrested. And every question was resolved in favor of filing a report, and DCF was flooded. And so this legislation is an attempt to bring a little more judgment and common sense. Again, it's critically important that we always report to DCF if there's a hint of concern, because we're talking about the welfare of children. But the new concept here is that if you're a mandated reporter, that you can conduct a preliminary inquiry, and that is ask questions like, actually, I wrote a column on this a month or so ago. You hear a rumor about something. Do you just call that rumor in? Or can you go and ask a student, or maybe the student shares the rumor with you? Can you talk further with that student? And interestingly, I thought that was fine. One of my colleagues used to work for DCF, and so she corrected me. And even that, prior to this law, would have been inappropriate. You heard a rumor, if you have reasonable cause to suspect or believe, you report it. My colleague did confirm that as of July 1, you can ask, well, where did that come from and who said it? And just ask some preliminary questions to see if this is just some crazy rumor or if there's any possibility that there's substance to the rumor. And DCF is supposed to refresh their training and include now further guidance on where you draw the line, what's a preliminary inquiry, and when do you step over the line into investigating, which you still can't do. But it's an interesting change in the law that I think will reduce, DCF has a critically important role, and no one wants them distracted with a bunch of unwarranted reports that they have to look into. There's another significant change in the DCF statute, and that is that right now, if a mandated reporter files a report, and sometimes most of the time, the report is unsubstantiated, and sometimes people who are the subject of a report are upset and in fact threaten legal action. Hey, that was unwarranted. What did you? And so what we have in the law is a good faith protection. If there's good faith, it's not some person in a parental dispute filing against their spouse without cause, but anyone who files a report in good faith, and we hope all of the reports are unsubstantiated, they're protected by the good faith indemnity protection. Well, that was extended in the last legislative session. And this now harks back to the way the law used to read before maybe 8 years ago. And that is that if you can show in good faith you didn't file a report, you're also protected. So it's a further protection for mandated reporters.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Tom, with this, so you mentioned before that teachers and superintendents were getting arrested.
Yes.
Does the change in law help with that as well? It gives a little leeway in the prosecution of that for those who may or may not report, now that you have the ability to investigate, and if you determine that the claim is unsubstantiated and therefore you don't file, can you still be arrested because you didn't file a claim?
Yes, in fact, one superintendent was arrested for not filing a report, even though when the report was filed, it was unsubstantiated, because they're two separate standards. The threshold is one thing and substantiation is something very different. But this new law will help in that regard. There are some technical changes. Right now, when DCF learns of a failure to report in a timely manner, they have to report that to the chief state's attorney. And that's where the prosecutions would sometimes then occur. But with the new standard of the preliminary inquiry and the new standard that I didn't file, but I did not do so in good faith, those will reduce the exposure for mandated reporters.
When is this in effect, this one, Tom?
Please.
When is this in effect?
Oh, July 1.
July 1.
So it is in effect now. I was writing the column right around July 1. And so it is a change in law as of that date. The next statute, and as I mentioned, you have this electronically, and so all you have to do, if you have the time and energy, is click on the link, and then the statute pops up and you can read the specific provisions. As you probably know, and there's something later in the discussion about mandates, there's been quite a bit of pushback because every legislative session, the General Assembly thinks of more things to add to the list of mandated trainings. And there's now some task force about educational mandates. And on behalf of CAPS, Shipman and Goodwin was involved in doing a list of all the mandates in the statutes. But now there's some further flexibility because in Section 2 of Public Act 2445, the PDEC, your Professional Development and Evaluation Committee, which now another initiative includes a paraprofessional a paraeducator representative, the PDEC determines when these various mandated trainings occur, as long as this list is covered at least once every 5 years. Alan, did you have a question?
No.
There's some further elaboration, even as they're saying PDEC has this authority. They also changed the requirements for training on school violence prevention and special education matters and added a new mandated training on emergency response to seizures. This next one, I don't know if you've taken action or are interested in taking action, but it's a significant change in the 2% non-lapsing fund. Have you?
We do not have one.
You do not have one? Well, I have news for you. The former statute said that the Board of Finance can create this non-lapsing fund. The Board of Finance can deposit up to 2% of your budget in non-expended funds, but then you do have control over the fund over the prior law, during the prior law. Well, now you have the authority to create this fund. You have the authority to make deposits into it. The limit is 2% of your annual budget. But obviously
For the record, you just created a lot of smiles around this table.
Well, I thought it might be an interesting topic.
Just a bit.
Right.
Okay.
Because the public policy concern that led to the enactment of 10248A originally was I wouldn't say this would happen in Darien, but in some school districts, they come to the end of the year, they have some extra money, and what are we going to do with this? And they spend it down, and perhaps not
What they want to say.
wisely.
Yeah.
And so this gives some opportunity for further reflection, because the way it works is that if you get an appropriation on an annual basis, you're authorized to expend those funds between July 1 and June 30. The next July 1 comes and that appropriation lapses, and by operation of law, the money that you haven't expended reverts to the town and you start with your new appropriation. So this is, I think, a wonderful new development, giving boards of education more control over their own budgetary practices. Any other questions on that? Yes, please.
Thanks, Tom. Do you know any of the background on why this change was recommended or made?
No, not any specifics, other than I know that CABE was quite interested in making this change. And one of my partners is the Speaker of the House, and I have talked to him about it, and they just say it makes sense. It's the board's money. The board should decide and cut out the middleman, which is the Board of Finance. Yes.
John and then Katie.
Oh, go ahead, Katie.
Thank you for this. I just wanted to clarify that with the 2%
Yes.
ceiling, that if we, if the Board of Education was to have more than a 2% surplus from the appropriation, that we'd be able to move the maximum 2% into a non-lapsing account, and then the rest of that would go back to the town as
Yes.
it has been? Okay.
Unexpended funds, because what you're essentially doing by moving the 2% into a non-lapsing account is you're expending the money. And so if there's unexpended funds in excess of what you've transferred, then it does revert to the town.
John?
Is there any restriction on how that non-lapsing account can be used? Is it?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, beyond, it has to be school funds, but.
No, that's it. That's the restriction. You have to spend it for educational purposes.
So it can be capital and or operation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, it's,
And-
now, when you get into capital expenditures, different towns have different rules about what is or is not a capital expenditure and what that process is. But there's nothing in the law imposing any restrictions. It simply says it has to be used for educational purposes.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Greg.
Is there a timeline to use the funds?
No,
like,
that's the beauty
so
of it.
once you
It's a
have it,
non-lapsing account and
it's
it can
forever.
accrue.
It
so
can
you
accrue.
You get 2% each year, it could just keep building.
Yes.
In theory.
Okay.
That was my question is you can accrue over time. So
It can,
So you could technically put in 2% every year.
right.
But the accrual is only if you put them, it's not like an accrual. When I think of like an accounting accrual, you can't, like, it's only cash that you actually put in the fund that you can keep in the fund.
Yes, although the detail is plus interest, I presume. In your non-lapsing fund, you're going to get some sort of interest, so that fund would grow. But you can contribute new funds every year, and until you spend it, it sits there and grows. Is that a better, because I'm not an accountant.
Just like an accrual it could mean that you don't put money in, then you just have an accrual sitting there and then you get to put it in later. It's not that. You have to
It's
actually
not
have the
that.
money.
You have to transfer the funds.
Okay.
Any
So-
other- that-
So we work collaboratively, but there's nothing to stop a Board of Finance anytime saying you've got 2% in there and your budget you're going to get moving forward is going to be reduced by 2%. I mean, there's nothing stopping that happening operationally.
Yeah.
Is
Correct.
that's an observation?
Yes.
That's a hypothetical.
Uh-huh.
Reality?
No, you're right. I mean, these are all moving parts and people are going to point to different opportunities
Right.
for expenditures. Right.
Educational purposes, when we define the budget, we say that everything educational is as defined by the statute. And then beyond that, the Board of Finance can opine. Is that the same educational purposes tied to the actual statute language for education, or is this just educational purposes in a vacuum?
The statute uses the phrase for educational purposes, and my view of the matter would be anything within the scope of your responsibilities as a Board of
Okay.
Ed would be an educational purpose. But there are limits, and you may, for example, think that the Red Cross is a worthy charity, and you would think it appropriate to contribute to the Red Cross. That would not be an educational purpose.
But what about like health insurance or something that isn't delivery of education, but certainly impacts?
Those are all, you can't deliver education without the infrastructure and providing health insurance benefits to your employees and so on. So for example, if the bill came in and your renewal was higher than anticipated, you could offset some of that increase. I'm just hypothetically, by using money from the non-lapsing account.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
So, any other,
Go ahead,
yes,
Rob. I have a question. So if you did end up using a certain portion of that growing balance
Yes.
of the 2% that we would potentially have every year, does that amount that then ends up getting, I guess, presumably transferred into our operating budget then become part of our annual budget that would be considered for kind of year-to-year comparisons? I'm just trying to understand
if you're using basically a pool of money that is not technically allocated as part of your annual budget process.
Yes, but it has been. And I think your question may relate to the MBR. There's a requirement in Connecticut that you cannot, in a given year, the municipality cannot appropriate to the Board of Ed less than what it appropriated in the prior year. And that's called the minimum budget requirement. And so the question would be, does this expenditure from this fund, now let's just say your budget was $100 million and now it's $100 million, $10,000. Okay. Is that the new floor for the future? It is not, because those funds have already been appropriated. So we ignore expenditures out of that fund in looking at what the required appropriation is for the coming year. Now, the good news here is that that may not even be a concept that is discussed in Darien, but in some communities, they are right up against the minimum budget requirement, and the municipality grudgingly, makes the appropriation. I would note that you're in a community that values education and provides support for education. So maybe this little detour on minimum budget requirement is irrelevant, but that would be the interaction.
Just to clarify, so two different things. I think Robin's question is slightly different, but if we had, let's say, 2 million in, for a round number, and the MBR, we were looking at the MBR, that
Right.
2 million would or would not count towards.
Does not count.
Would not count.
Because we only look at what did the town appropriate in one year against the next year.
The next year.
And so, that $2 million was already appropriated.
Yeah.
So, and then you can spend it just out of cycle.
Okay. Robin, I think your question is really an internal answer for how we handle our finances. I don't think it's a legislative.
Well, I mean, there's one more, just from a process standpoint, though. But with the town, I'm assuming that this pool of money, the town would still go through a budget approval process with the Board of Finance, the RTM vote, but then say they vote to approve a certain pool of money. After that vote, the Board of Ed potentially could end up going back and saying, okay, well, we're now going to use XYZ amount of money from this pool to supplement what the RTM and Board of Finance actually approved.
Yes.
Correct.
And then increase, if we needed to, by a certain amount of dollars from this pool. Is that correct?
Right.
And it's not subject to RTM or Board of Finance votes.
Just Board of
at that
Correct.
point.
Just go ahead, Rich.
Okay.
So typically when you have a non-lapsing account, you wouldn't use it to supplement recurring expenses, so staff, because then this is going to make your following year's budget much worse. So districts that have it tend to use it for things like textbooks, computer equipment, facility repairs. As Tom mentioned, it just kind of accumulates, and then it's almost like a transfer. You transfer out a non-lapsing account, and then maybe you buy $100,000 of math textbooks or whatever.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Other questions?
Jill, the MBR is a new concept to me, so I had a follow-up question. Is that okay to ask
Sure.
now? Okay, thank you. So, Tom, with regards to the minimum budget requirement, I was just curious if there were an extenuating factor, say a large drop in enrollment or something, if there are ever exceptions.
Yes.
Okay.
The statute specifies if you close a school, there are certain ways in which to modify how the MBR applies in a given situation.
Great, thank you.
Dennis.
Going back to an earlier question, do you know what prompted the reason for having this non-lapsing 2%?
Yes.
That's we have a pretty high budget, but I'm assuming other schools had similar $100 million budgets. So you're talking, a lot of money.
Yeah, and as I said, it's just as a matter of public policy, the anecdotal information to the General Assembly is that June often involves a spending spree because we got to spend our money. And this is a way to have boards of ed not feel so pressured to spend on their appropriation at the end of the year, because they can just park it and wait for it to accumulate and then do something, as Richard said, is more of a isolated investment. As Richard said, you certainly don't want to use that money in a budget year to address recurring expenses because then you're creating a hole in your budget for the following year.
But couldn't towns that don't budget well think, I mean, you build up $6-7 million in your non-lapsing account and your Board of Finance says, you have this money, I don't need to give you this much, and then your budgets are going. I just, to me, this is.
It's an interesting political dynamic because they certainly can point to that. But to the extent that a town, and I'm not talking about Darien, a town would have that reaction, then you're essentially then discouraging the Board of Education from being responsible at the end of the year. It's a discussion.
Rich, thank you, Tom. What is your experience?
So it does happen often where maybe a board will come in with a budget, let's say at 4, and you have $500,000 in the non-lapsing account, and the town will say, well, you have that money, use it for something else. And then they use that non-lapsing account to help reconcile their budget.
Okay.
So I know what happened in Newtown, for example, this past year.
Okay.
So
All right, John.
it's one of the checks and balances in our budget process that amongst all town entities.
Right. Well, I'll move on. High school graduation requirements is a perennial favorite of the General Assembly. They're always modifying that in one way or another. The current law, or prior to this public act, included a requirement that students complete the free application for federal student assistance. This defers that requirement and exempts certain international students. I thought this is an interesting little twist. Right now, a child can get, a school can set up, a district can set up a half credit for community service. And when that opportunity for credit for community service was created, the General Assembly said, but you can't not engage in partisan political activity and get credit. Well, now you can. I don't know why, but they changed the law to strike that prohibition. So a student could engage with the local political party as a volunteer, and that would be considered a community service. One, as you may know, students starting at grade 6 have to districts have to provide or prepare student success plans. As that statutory process is followed, now consideration has to be given to enrollment in the technical education and career systems, which some of us would remember as referred to as vocational schools, the state vocational schools. There are some minor changes in the student discipline statutes. In-school suspension is now limited to 5 consecutive days, and there are new requirements. If you suspend a preschooler through grade 2 out of school, which would be an extraordinary circumstance, there are new requirements for that. There are new requirements. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here. There are new requirements with regard to SRO reports. There are certain circumstances where the SRO is required to file a report if he or she investigates or gets involved in a behavioral intervention when student misbehavior escalates to violence or crime. And so they've modified that slightly.
Julie has a question.
Quick question. Would that apply to SSOs as well?
SSS?
SSO, school security officers. We have SROs and we also have SSOs.
No, the SRO is the requirement, and the difference in my understanding would be an SRO is a sworn police officer. SSO is not. And so no, these requirements apply to SROs. Yes.
So I just want to confirm that this is saying that the SROs will get involved in fights.
They may.
And that's a change from our current practice?
Oh, no, actually, we have to go back a couple years. Every district is required to enter into a memorandum of understanding with your SROs to define the role of the SRO. And so it's in that context that the SROs, in accordance with a memorandum of understanding, may well be called upon to intervene if there's a fight, and if there's been a fight, now they're investigating, and it turns out that that action by a particular student constitutes an assault, which is a crime. That has to be investigated, and the normal path, and this just modifies that path slightly, is SRO writes the report to the chief of police. The chief of police gives the report to the superintendent. The superintendent gives the report to the Board of Ed.
So
That's current law.
So Alan, how does this change for our current practice?
It may, well, just even that end one, it may be submitted directly to the superintendent of schools. That's not a practice that happens here.
And it's an exception only if the police chief does not meet certain standards. So it's a big deal generally. This is a small deal because it's only accepting that, creating an exception to that path. When the police chief doesn't have a certain credential, then the SRO sends the report directly to the superintendent. Okay?
Yep.
Now, the next statutory change relates to the implementation of the bullying statute. Last year, there was a fundamental change in the bullying statute, but it was not implemented immediately. And in fact, boards of ed have until next July 1 to do it. But the process is that all boards of ed have to adopt a school climate policy that CABE was charged with writing. And the Social and Emotional Learning and School Climate Advisory Collaborative was in charge of approving. That's all been done. Boards of ed, and this board included, at some point between now and July 1 of next year, has to adopt that policy. And that policy reflects a rather detailed statutory procedure where each school has a school climate committee. Each school climate committee has to do a survey every year. They have to create a school climate improvement plan. And, you know, that the mechanics of the new bullying statute, and they have a new definition, the sixth definition in bullying since 2002. It's a complicated process. This legislation simply says that this social and emotional learning and school climate advisory collaborative will establish standards for school climate surveys and will draft a model school climate improvement plan, and boards are authorized to use those resources. So that's where that is. Disconnected youth. I was curious. I put a link in here, and I'm not necessarily asking for hands raised, but are some of you aware of the study that the Dalio Education Foundation sponsored on disconnected youth? I've linked the report here in case you're interested, but disconnected youth is a concern. And and their definitions of what is or is not a disconnected youth. But the conclusion was that 1 in 5 young people between the ages of 14 and 26, I think, are disconnected in some way. And this is not a direct Board of Ed responsibility, but it's a social concern that will implicate your work. The statute defines at-risk students. The statute defines disconnected youth. I've provided those definitions. And now a different entity, the Connecticut Preschool through 20 and Workforce Information Network, is now charged with providing technical support and data agreements, trying to create the infrastructure for serving disconnected youth. many of whom are not even within your jurisdiction anymore. But it's a social concern. The next statute, section 23 of this law is directly affecting boards of education. And that is that now if a youth services bureau, and do you have a youth services bureau here in Darien?
Yes.
If they come forward and say, we want to collaborate more on serving children with problems, and one way to do that is to have better knowledge of how they're achieving in school. What are their grades? What are they participating in, and so on. But as you probably know, there's a federal law, FERPA, that says that personally identifiable student information cannot be disclosed except with parent permission. But under FERPA, there is this concept of a school official. All teachers, for example, have the right to access student information if they have a legitimate educational need. You as board members have the right to access student information, but only if you have a legitimate educational need, and that's rarely the case. If you were doing an expulsion hearing, for example, then you would have a legitimate educational need. Well, so the construct here is that youth services bureaus in certain functions would serve as school officials supporting the work of the school district, and they can receive student information. And I actually rewrote the the youth services bureaus came up with a memorandum on the subject. It was a good start. And on behalf of CABE and CAPS, I rewrote it, and we're waiting to hear if they liked my rewrite. But the plan here is that every school district shouldn't be charged with a negotiation. Let's, through CABE and CAPS, let's have a standard template that the youth services bureaus are okay with, we're okay with. And then if they come forward, this would create the rules by which this school district can share student information to further the work of the Youth Services Bureau as well as the Board of Education. Credit recovery programs.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Who is the youth
depot.
service? Okay.
Was it?
The depot. And
Greg.
I'm just trying to understand. So the definition for disconnected youth includes 26-year-olds who are unemployed.
Yes.
So that somehow is now somehow connected to the Board of Ed's purview?
Sure.
There's no button on mine.
Yeah.
Pull it closer. Yeah.
No, it's not. No. So what we have is an overlap. Some of the disconnected youth are within your jurisdiction, and some of them are not. And so it's the disconnected youth is 14 to 26. So some of them are clearly not your issue. Some of these children may be enrolled in your school. Some of these children may have dropped out of the Darien Public Schools. If you're interested and you get to the report, it's very interesting. In Wyndham, for example, over 40%, that's a poor community out near Yukon. Over 40% fall within the category of disconnected youth. You can click on the map. I clicked on Darien. It's between 10 and 20% fall within that definition. But as you point out, many of those would not be even within your concern because they're beyond the age for schooling. The credit recovery programs, I don't know, there must have been some circumstance where there was a distinction. Well, you're enrolled in school, so you can't participate in credit recovery. This law clarifies that no, credit recovery programs are accessible to students who are enrolled in school. The next statute on page 7 is about further elaboration on something that came up last year, and this is a big deal, and that's air quality in the schools and the requirement for inspections. And the law just refined some of that to say that the inspections have to be conducted between 2026 and 2031. You have to inspect at least 20% of your schools in a year, and every 5 years thereafter. The next statute, as you may have heard, there was statewide controversy over a law passed last year that required that all school districts implement their reading programs through specified programs specified by an entity in collaboration with the State Department of Ed. There are some refinements to the statute, but I bring it to your attention simply to say that despite the fact that the General Assembly was looking at this issue, and despite the fact that CAPS and CABE were saying this cuts too broadly and all school districts should not have to do this. If we're doing fine in reading, why would we have to change our program? They left these requirements untouched. The State Department of Ed is supposed to now conduct a study about advanced placement programs and how districts can support students in advanced placement programs. This next one is well, they're all interesting, right? But this Public Act 2481 requires the commissioner to develop a plan to render the State Board of Ed an advisory body and have the commissioner be in charge. I don't think this is going to trickle down to local boards of education, where the board becomes an advisory body. But the State Board of Ed is on potentially on its way to obsolescence. I just don't know the reason for this, but that's something the commissioner is charged with doing, and she has to report by January 1st of 2026. Another example of the support for paraeducators in that same law, there's currently paraeducators have the opportunity to get state subsidies for health insurance under certain circumstances that I'm not conversant with. That because that's an independent program. That program was extended for a year. I don't know if Margie have any comment. Pardon?
We did it this past year.
Did it?
The state funded the document.
And now it's been extended
That's what we would have to bring it
for a year. Yeah. This is a good one. As there's always this tension between how much do we test and how much do we educate, and are we detracting from our mission to educate kids by testing them and testing them and testing them. And now the State Department of Ed has to conduct a comprehensive audit of the assessments that students must take. And then you see here the list of the responsibilities of the audit. One of the issues here is discouraging classroom activities that focus only on test preparation. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. I don't know if anyone here has any comment on state assessments, but there's a certain suspicion that perhaps the process could be improved, and we're supposedly going to find out through an audit, and that's due in January of 2026. To the relief of some districts, not Darien, but Greenwich and Fairfield specifically, the racial balance law has been suspended for a year. I don't know if that could be a whole topic, the racial balance law, and the public good or not that it does, because we still have extraordinary racial isolation in Connecticut. It'll be 30 years in 2 years since Sheff versus O'Neill was passed. But I don't know if this is so that they can study it further, but they've suspended the law for a year. An oddball new law reads as follows, and this is the prohibition against requiring parent to participate in school activities. And it is now legally prohibited to require a parent or guardian of a student to participate in school activities, such as through volunteering, as a condition for the enrollment of such student in a school under the jurisdiction of the board. Now, I have no idea why this law was passed, because if I'm a resident, I'm entitled to go to school unless I've graduated from high school. It would simply be unauthorized to say as a school district, well, your mom better do X, Y, and Z. We take the children as they come along a continuum of parent support. But for whatever reason, the General Assembly thought it was necessary to clarify that school districts can ask, but they can't require parents involve themselves in a certain way. The next one is a simple thing. I don't know if it's.
Can I ask a question, Tom? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
please.
On that one, we do require that a parent attend a meeting with a student in order for a student to participate in extracurricular activities. Would that fall under this? Not,
Not on its face.
okay. We're not requiring it for kids to enroll in school. But
Right.
We're requiring it for them
Right.
to participate.
And is that because of the requirements that parents be notified of concussion
No.
and heat? Because parents are,
It came from, we originally had some policies in place about what would happen if a student were drinking or using substances during their season. So there was a commitment policy. The commitment policy, and you signed it, and then you lost, I think, captaincy and or the ability to participate in the sport. It was replaced with a required session in which a parent and a student at the beginning, or an athlete or other extracurricular participant must attend a session that is informational in nature. It could be about substance abuse. Last year was about mental health. It could be about some other topic of interest.
And it's all extracurriculars, not just athletic.
Thank you. All extracurriculars.
Yes.
So, and they must participate in that at the beginning of each season. So fall, winter, and spring.
well, I'll leave to you. I mean, it sounds reasonable, but it's certainly legal because extracurricular activities are a privilege and there's well-established case law on that. You can condition that privilege, participation in extracurricular activities as you see fit.
Thank you.
The new legislation requires that the State Department of Ed now estimate your ECS grant by December 31st in each year. That's more significant in some districts than others, as you might imagine. But I think the date December 31st is related to the annual budget process so that, you can at least estimate what's coming in from the town and the board as you work through the budget process.
Is there a range that they have to be within in their estimate?
Nope, it's just an estimate. We did our best.
So this doesn't change anything for us, does it?
No, what, do they give you estimates now?
We get something now.
Get something from the state, you only get about $1,000.
That's what I meant about, it's more significant in other districts than others. Yes, this is just now perhaps codifying a practice. Because I've seen in the paper, this is the estimated amounts, but it's by December 31st. Just wrapping up here, right now, if a student's behavior causes serious disruption or self-harm or physical harm to a teacher or student, a classroom teacher can say, I want a behavior intervention meeting of the crisis intervention team. This law elaborates on that such that in these circumstances, when these circumstances arise, the principal now has to tell the parent that this event occurred and inform the parent further that the teacher is authorized to request a behavior intervention meeting. And it goes on to say, if that meeting is held within 7 days, the parent has to receive, you see here at the end, a written summary of the meeting, including but not limited to the resources and supports identified, not later than 7 days after that meeting.
But the parent is not necessarily a participant in that meeting
By
by law?
I don't know. whether the parent would be invited. I don't know, Shirley, if you know, the parent could be invited,
They could be.
but it's not like a PPT where the parent has a legal entitlement.
Alan, what's our current practice on that?
There's, my understanding of this, Tom, is that the change is just notifying the parents, because up to this point, a teacher may request a meeting.
Yes,
Crisis team.
well, it's actually the changes on the front end, even if the teacher doesn't request the meeting, if the child engages in this behavior, then notification to the parent must be given by the principal. But it's a fairly high standard. It's a serious disruption to the instruction of other students, self-harm or physical harm to the teacher or another student. In those circumstances, there's now an affirmative duty to notify the parent. And if then a behavior intervention meeting comes out of it, then we have to notify the parent.
In practice, the parents have probably already been notified, because by the time a teacher really comes to the table or otherwise, or it comes through the student support team, crisis teams or otherwise, the parents already been apprised of it. This generally would be the case. This is just, in my opinion, this is memorializing the need to actually notify the parent.
Mhm. And there's already in the statute, and it has been for decades, a requirement that if discipline is ever imposed on a child, and in these circumstances,
right.
discipline would certainly be a possibility or probability. But from time immemorial, within 24 hours of disciplinary action, the school officials have to notify the parent of the disciplinary action. So this is really more just expanding that notification. And I have included for your reference a number of different task forces, including a task force on educational mandates. But I'd like to end and get into the scenarios with a question. Does anyone in this room know what the background is on the following prohibition? The General Assembly saw it fit to modify the basic statute on educational Board of Ed duties and responsibilities to add the prohibition you see in the middle of page 10. A Board of Ed may not delegate the authority to schedule interscholastic games on Thanksgiving Day to any nonprofit organization or other entity that is otherwise responsible for governing interscholastic athletics in the state, and shall not adopt a policy or prohibition against the scheduling of an interscholastic football game on Thanksgiving Day.
Yeah, there was some
I
discussion.
can only infer there's a story here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion. Yeah.
Does it involve? Okay, well, anyway, we now.
Legislators focusing on turkey.
This is right up there with the other statutory changes. So that is a run through of the legislation. And I appreciate your questions and your patience. I did bring 3 scenarios for your, that's. Here they are. I did bring 3 scenarios to discuss, because sometimes it's just good to talk about these things. So I'll pass these around if you wouldn't mind. And in the remaining time, and this is where through these 3 scenarios, I'm hoping to just, and they're coming around, hoping to discuss with you how you see your roles and your responsibilities to act as board members. And
I think they're in the packet.
the first one, as it's coming around, is as follows. A board member is Facebook friends with a teacher. In a post on his Facebook page, the teacher complains that his principal unfairly denied him 3 days of personal leave to attend nature's classroom in a neighboring school district to serve as a chaperone. Did you have enough coming around?
It's in the packet anyway.
Okay, so the board member, the guy puts this on Facebook. A board member sees it on Facebook, calls the principal. What's the story? The teacher files a grievance that's denied at the lower levels and now is before the board. Can the board member participate in the grievance hearing? This one who said, called the principal? Or does the board member have a conflict of interest preventing him from participating? Pardon?
Cannot participate.
You're saying there's a conflict of interest, okay? Any other views? How do you define conflict of interest? I can help, but you can.
I mean, I would always appreciate the help. I was thinking because the board member had inserted themselves in this, in the proceedings, so to
Right.
speak, or in the way this played out, that would constitute a conflict of interest.
Okay. John, did you have a?
Yes, just a broad definition of
Yeah,
conflict.
how do
It
you-
would be, if
What's
you have a
conflict?
personal interest that you would benefit in terms of a decision or something, or involvement in an issue.
That conflict of interest is technically financial.
I'm sorry?
Thought conflict of interest was technically financial. in
It
this.
can be, and that's the clearest. Although even defining a financial interest has its limits because the contract you're voting on goes to a board member's spouse. That would be clear. The contract you're voting on would go to the board member's child, the board member's cousin, the board member's college roommate. You know, so just the general rule is a conflict of interest would, and a financial conflict is, it affects the household income. And if it doesn't affect the household income, then it can still be a conflict of interest, but it's not clearly driven by, in fact, law. You know, there was a governor who got a hot tub at one point. And that was, I think he went to jail for that one. So that invites us to talk further about what is a conflict of interest. And to build on what John said, the voters put you in these responsibilities to do the public's work. And so a conflict of interest for a board member would be any personal interest that interferes with your action on behalf of the public. And it can go both ways. It can be an animosity, or it can be an affection for a particular person. So now the next question is, let's say that it's the board member's college roommate or former business partner. You as the other board members are convinced that this board member cannot act clearly on behalf of the public because of that personal connection. Can a majority of the board vote to say, you have a conflict of interest, you can't vote?
Oh, wait.
So you're saying, so who gets to decide what a conflict of interest is?
The person.
Have we done this before?
I've been sued in P and Z, so.
Right. So, well, you speak
For that
with
very
some
reason.
authority. And that's exactly right. And the premise is that you were installed in your positions by the public. And so no other board member has the authority to tell you how to do your business. In certain egregious circumstances, which I've never encountered, a person, I guess, could say, no, I'm voting, and that ends up being a criminal act. But other than that, as you say, it's an internal thing. You say, can I act on behalf of the public without interference?
In a fair and non-capricious manner.
I'm sorry?
In a fair and non-capricious manner, and yeah, all that.
Right. The other thing I wanted to just mention in terms of conflict of interest is the appearance of conflict. And that is that as a board member considers a relationship with that affects potentially action on something within your jurisdiction, you can be absolutely sure that it doesn't affect your ability to focus on the public interest. But sometimes that's not enough because the public may not have the same confidence that despite the fact that this is your best friend, you can act in the public's interest. So board members are also expected to consider the appearance of conflict and the public perception of the integrity of the board. And sometimes even then, when you're convinced you can act on behalf of the public without interference, there's an appearance that would suggest otherwise, and it's prudent, but not required. This is where you get back to the internal monologue over whether you have a conflict, but appearances of conflict are.
I've heard you clarify before when you talk about appearances of conflict of interest, that doesn't mean you shouldn't participate in a conversation or even a decision that may have a direct impact. So for example, we're funding some sort of program that you know your child will be a part of, or we are talking about a section of education. Like let's say somebody has a child who receives special education services or talented and gifted services that is, or plays on XYZ football team or is in theater. We're all here regardless of whether or not
Right.
we bring personal interest to the table. So if you wouldn't mind just making that.
Well, sure, to elaborate, when, if it was totally rigid, you couldn't even vote on the budget.
Right.
Right. So, because that will affect the taxes you pay. So, whenever an action comes before the board that applies to many people, including potentially a board member's child or relative, if it applies to a group generally, that's not considered a conflict, and nor should people consider appearance of conflict, because there are only 9 of you and you have important responsibilities, and so we don't want to be overly rigid in terms of when board members can participate. But I would like to further elaborate on one thing, and that is if you have a conflict or you decide there's an appearance of conflict, then you're done in terms of that deliberative process. It's not appropriate if there's a conflict to say, well, he's my brother-in-law, I'm not going to vote, but he's a great guy. As soon as you contribute to the discussion, you're affecting potentially the outcome. So if you have a conflict of interest, I have a conflict of interest, and you recuse yourself not only from the vote, but from the discussion.
Thank you.
And under what circumstances is it appropriate for the board member to call a principal to find out what the problem is? And the answer is simple: never. And if you have an issue, you talk to the superintendent and you go from there. Okay, this next one I wrote specially for you. With a contentious national election looming, the policy committee is considering a recommendation that the board adopt the following policy. No member of the Darien Public School community shall engage in political activity when on the property of the Darien Public Schools. Accordingly, the board prohibits employees and students from displaying any messages conveying support for any political candidate for state or federal office. This prohibition extends to buttons, hats, t-shirts, or other apparel, and to signs on personal vehicles or messages on personal vehicles, including but not limited to bumper stickers or signs. Okay, so now this proposed policy has received a lot of public attention, and some members of the board who are not on the policy committee want to attend the meeting at which this would be discussed. Is it a problem if a quorum of the full board comes to the policy committee meeting to talk about this policy? It's not.
They can attend, they can't all participate.
Okay, and that's the critical distinction you correctly point out. If you give special privileges to members of the board who are not on the committee to recognize them to speak, hey, Joe, what do you think? Then potentially you're having that meeting of the policy committee morph into a meeting of the board, which has not been posted. But if you are rigorous, the board members who attend have the same right. So if you offer comment opportunity to the public at large, the board member can comment, but you cannot treat the board member especially. And in fact, there's a provision in the Freedom of Information Act saying specifically that if a quorum of one public agency attends a meeting properly posted by another, that's not automatically a problem. And so you rely on the posting, but you have to respect the posting. So it's a meeting of the policy committee. The other board members, as you say, can attend but can't participate. Yes.
Tom, is that only when there's a quorum of the full board? Like, for example, if it was, let's say, just one or possibly even two additional board members attended a subcommittee that they weren't on, does that same invitation to participate apply if there's not a
The
quorum?
same legal principle does not apply because the concern is under FOI. You have a quorum participating in a meeting that has not been posted. But I would say that the same practice should apply because it's a fluid situation and you don't want to have to try and figure out. I think just to have a strict procedure, you're welcome to attend this meeting, but you're attending it as an observer, even if you're not at that moment in time exposed to a quorum of the full board being in attendance.
Thank you.
Do you think this policy is legal? You don't think it's legal?
Let's say the bumper sticker is excessive and place banner restriction.
That's what tipped me off. The bumper sticker part is excessive, I think is what Dave said.
Okay. Can you prohibit teachers from wearing buttons in school? Political buttons. Can you prohibit a teacher from posting a political advertisement in their classroom?
Yes.
Okay. So we all agree on that?
Yes.
These questions involve considerations of the rights of people under the First Amendment and the rights of government officials. I would agree with John because the classroom is not a forum for speech. Whenever you talk about free speech, the question is it a forum? And for example, can you prohibit all students from wearing T-shirts with messages? The answer is sure. That's like a dress code. But you can't prohibit students from wearing only certain messages. And so in First Amendment law, the first question is, have you created a forum? And if so, within that forum, are you engaged in viewpoint discrimination? Are you permitting certain messages and prohibiting others based on viewpoint? But categories of speech is not viewpoint discrimination. And I don't pretend to have all the answers here. And we're going to have to figure this out as the election approaches. But political speech is a category of speech. And as long as you're not differentiating between political parties, but saying, we just are going to keep politics out of the school, you certainly can do that with teachers. It's not as clear with students because the rules are different. The First Amendment rules applying to students are that you have to reasonably forecast material disruption or substantial interference with the educational process. So that's a question. Yes.
Just one question, because I'm thinking of like the government class when they want to do a debate and have students, defending different sides of an issue that may be a political kind of a context. And, in the name of kind of allowing them to figure out how to make arguments, debate different matters and subjects, and especially in an election year, what is the appropriate rule for not only for the teachers, but I guess this is even referencing students. And I'm just a little unclear on the distinction between using that as part of a classroom exercise? Is it just to give everyone an opportunity to kind of talk about an issue? Or I'm just interested in your view on how that would be handled.
I think that educational activity would be completely appropriate because as you described in your hypothetical, people are arguing both sides. That's an educational experience and you're not favoring one particular view or suppressing another.
Okay, thank you.
So the last scenario, because I don't want to overstay my welcome, is as follows. A good friend of a board member sends the board member an email marked personal and confidential. The friend of the board member complains to the board member that a teacher was mean to her daughter. A reporter makes an FOI request of all board members for a copy of any email sent to and from a third party during a specified period. This falls within that period. So, is this email a public record?
Yes.
It's a public record. Any recorded information about board business is a public record. If you receive it even, not just when you create it. Is this email subject to disclosure in response to the FOI request?
Yes, but meaning the name might be eradicated to
Redacted. Be
redacted.
redacted, but yes.
Take the name out of the student, but yes.
Any personally identifiable information. So if one could infer, you can't just redact the name if there's a context that from which a person could infer. So it sounds like you didn't need this scenario, but just to elaborate a little bit more. So all communications by email or text, any recorded information in whatever format, dealing with the Darien Public Schools that you receive as board members is a public record. But as with any other public record, there are exemptions from disclosure. And FERPA is one of those exemptions. So if the parent is reaching out to you about a student matter, then it would be a public record exempt from disclosure. If the parent is reaching out to you about almost anything else, it's going to be a public record. So you may already have warned your friends to be aware that marking an email to a board member confidential is actually worse than not doing that, right? Because then you still have to, then it has a headline, oh, this is confidential. So anyway, well, you're a very sophisticated Board of Education. I can do more good when people don't know the rules, but you're very good. You got all the answers right. And I just wonder if you have any other questions before I know you have a full day's agenda.
Any other questions for Tom while he's here? Okay, well then, go ahead, Dennis.
So recently I read, I should have done this before, but I read an online thing about a school in Pennsylvania where the students impersonated teachers' online personas. And then were saying, they got pictures and they were saying they had a teacher with younger children saying, I like young kids. And obviously it's totally inappropriate, but the school didn't seem to have any repercussions on what to do with these students. And are we okay with that, or how would we handle something like that?
I vaguely remember that, and I was surprised that, I think that if a student engages in impersonating a teacher to undermine that teacher's credibility, that's a disciplinary offense, and that the student does not have, back to the Tinker standard, it's a high bar, but if it seriously disrupts the educational process, and that would seem to do that. So I would, every case you look at the specific facts, but I would not take the position that we're helpless when a kid goes online and engages in misconduct of that nature. Whether it's defamatory, that's a separate analysis. But I certainly think that student online activity can be the subject of school discipline. There's a recent case involving a cheerleader who was vulgar when she didn't make the varsity team. She got kicked off the team, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court tried to give us guidance. They overturned the lower court saying that there was no authority. But particularly now when you're off campus with online activity, it's a high bar. But I would take the position you still can do something about that particular circumstance.
Thank you.
Robin?
Just one last question is the conflict of interest bullet point on scenario 3, we didn't really talk about. And I'm just interested in your view. And I know we talked about definitions of whether the board member has a conflict of interest if they were making an action about the teacher at some point. Obviously you're saying, and this is a reporter that's making a FOIA request. And so obviously there can be an appearance of a conflict of interest. I'm just interested in what your perspective would be on that.
In that particular case, it depends on how long ago it was. And this is now, the only time a board would act on a teacher would be to fire the teacher. Under the law, the superintendent supervises and evaluates all teachers, takes disciplinary action. But in that rare circumstance where the superintendent recommends termination of a teacher's employment, the board is an impartial judge and is a matter of due process. The board has to show that it was, its members were truly impartial. So if that board member wrote that 10 years ago, I don't know, I guess there'd still be a question as compared to if the board member wrote that last month.
I think it was the friend of the board member that sent an email to the board about their daughter. So, I guess my thinking is that not only firing, but the board also votes when we evaluate like potential people that might be hired at a certain level, right? But is that not considered?
Administrators, not teachers.
Right. So for administrators, people that are potentially interviewing for an administrator role, the board also votes on those positions. And so does this kind of come into play from that
in the
standpoint?
hiring process, that's a discretionary act by the board. The concern is due process if someone's being deprived of property, life, liberty, and property without due process of law. So that's when the constitutional concern about a conflict of interest and impartiality or lack of impartiality would come in. These are hypotheticals, but if the board had some appointment before it and you had some information, I think that wouldn't be a legal issue. You would just make your best judgment. It's only if you're taking property away from someone that you would have the prohibition against acting if you were not impartial.
Okay, thank you.
So it is 10:30. Thank you, Tom. I think what I'd love to suggest is that we take a 5-minute recess. I will start back at 10:35. So if you're not here, but sorry, Julie, to do this to you, but I have to take a motion to recess and then we'll do a motion to reconvene. Okay, so we have a motion to recess. Dennis, seconded by John. All those in favor? That is unanimous. And are we live on your end? Great. All right, we have a motion to reconvene in public session. That's Julie, seconded by Dennis. All those in favor? That is unanimous. Patrice, I'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come and play a role in your annual retreat. I always have to compliment you for taking the time to do this. We encourage all boards to have an annual retreat, but we recognize how difficult that can be with schedules, no matter what time of the year it is, to make the time and make the commitment to do this. So I do commend you for that. We're delighted that Jill is a member of the K Board of Directors and represents you very credibly in our meetings. And we really appreciate that level of engagement. So thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
when I begin to talk about your self-evaluation, I always want to make it clear that when the responses come into CABE, I do not see the individual responses. So it's completely anonymous. An administrative assistant prepares the summary for me. And so the intent behind that is, first of all, so that board members feel free to be honest and forthright in their comments. And so that when we meet together, I don't know, as I look around the room, who may have rated one category particularly high or one category particularly low. So just understand that that's the context for our discussion. What I always take note of are both the areas where the majority of the board feels the board is functioning very well, and then areas where there seems to be a disparity in perspectives as to how the board is doing. So we'll spend a little more time on that, but I always want to make sure that you take the chance to celebrate the things that you are doing well, because it's a long board meeting year, I know. And you put a lot of time and effort and attention, not just into the time that you spend at board meetings, but in all your other engagements in the Darien community. So taking a moment to celebrate is really important. You celebrate your students, you're intentional about that. You need to celebrate your work as volunteer board members. Now, the other part of the context is we only got responses from 5 of the 9 board members. So if anyone didn't respond to the self-evaluation and wants to provide comment and input during this discussion this morning, please feel free to do so. So the first area that we look at is the vision. And for the most part, this is an area where board members feel you are very successful, that you have a vision and a mission for the district with a focus on student achievement, and that you develop that mission and goals, that you have a process for long-range and strategic planning, you communicate your goals clearly. We'll talk about communication a little more later on, however, and that your board goals align with the mission and vision of the district. Now, I would point out that while this is an area to celebrate, there are 1 or maybe 2 members of the board that don't necessarily see the board as being successful in this area. So I think one suggestion I would have to you is to, as a board, make sure that you periodically revisit your vision, make sure that you do all embrace the vision as it's been articulated. And if there are questions or not understanding necessarily how the vision is played out in your district, that you have that conversation as a board with your superintendent. Does anyone want to comment on the vision piece? Greg.
Yeah, I mean, I was one of those too. I'll be transparent about that. And the reason for that is because when I read through the vision here as defined by CABE, a lot of it seemed to be very focused on student achievement. And then when I look at our vision of the graduate that's on the wall right there, the concept of student achievement does not exist. So it seems like the vision that we have outlined is inconsistent with what has been put in place by CABE.
I do want to follow up on
Go
that.
ahead, that's fine, Patricia.
And I want to follow up on that just because when I look at the vision of Darien Public Schools, preparing all students today to thrive in a changing world tomorrow, and I compare that to, there's one of these on here that is specifically talking about how, or if we do focus on the student achievement, it was very hard to kind of correlate the vision of the whole public school district, because it did not, to Greg's point, it didn't really seem to focus in on that particular aspect, which the superintendent evaluation is based on, our self-evaluation is based on, and that I think it seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect. And I mean, you could get there saying that, you know, of course, we're focusing on student achievement because we're trying to help them to thrive in a changing world tomorrow. But I don't know if other districts have something that's a little bit more well-defined, and I'm a new board member. It's a little unclear to me, and maybe this is something that all districts do, but I don't know.
So Patrice, before we keep moving, can you give us a little more information about what Kate means when it says student achievement? How is that defined?
Yeah. And this is making me think about whether we need to revise parts of the, no, this is helpful feedback. That's why we do, this is not a static document that this is, you know, set in stone for every generation, just like your vision is not set in stone. We would define student achievement very broadly. So it would include all of those attributes. While we used to, as a society, traditionally think about, you know, high test scores, but now it is a much broader, are we preparing young people to function, to be lifelong learners, to have the skills, the executive functioning skills, all those other things in addition to academic achievement. Does that help?
I think, go ahead, John, did you, after that, did you want to say something?
Would you say what you were going to say, sorry?
Well, no, I just thought it was important that I think we're not in alignment on what student achievement means. And I think we need to be as a board. So I'd mark that as something we need to be talking about. I suspect that's some of what John's raising your hand about, but you both have your hands up, so.
So the vision of the graduate document is 3 pages long, that just that line in that. And yeah. So the vision of the graduate document is actually 3 pages long. So I get like that summary line at the top, you were pointing to the top, right?
I've got it open here for 2 to 3 pages.
Yeah, and so I get the criticism. I just, you know, as a result, we believe we will graduate individuals who have strong academic foundation and prepared to use the knowledge and skills that they have acquired to cast and fulfill a purposeful vision for themselves, their community, and the world. So there is a mention of academics in it, not in that kind of summary page, but.
At the same time, Greg, you've noted before that, and I think we've been at something at a point in time. And I do think there's some value to, this is a community that wants to know what is happening educationally and how are we prioritizing that. I think our literacy work is an example of that. And I do think that there are areas where we might want to say, where are we pushing the envelope educationally and be more explicit about that? So in the area of technology, what are we doing to enhance teaching and learning? We have some of that in the strat plan. I'm not saying we don't have it, but some of our, I think some of our language might need to be stronger so that it's clear what we are in service of, and that education is our focus. Okay, I'll park that. Julie, then Greg.
Thank you. 2 thoughts. Patrice, I did have a note that I did feel that the document was heavy on that term, student achievement, which I do think is a little vague, or perhaps I understand what you intend by it and not sure that it's always taken that way. So just to add to that thought that you had. And then as far as this goes, I do think that there's discussion to have here, because I hear what Greg's saying and I hear what others are saying. Student achievement, success, rigor, all of these words mean different things depending on the student you're talking about. And it becomes our responsibility to help dimensionalize that and help obviously address and meet that for all students. But achievement isn't straight A's and a 1600 for every kid in the building, obviously. And I know we know that. So there are terms that, I don't want to say they've lost their meaning, but they require more language today than they did 20, 30 years ago. And so, yes, I think that is an area to spend some energy on.
Pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo the part about just understanding what we mean by student achievement. I mean, it's not strictly academics. Obviously, it can mean a lot of different things. There's extracurriculars, there's other things that students do. And so I don't necessarily think the student achievement should just be stripped from that document, because I do think it's important. It's just, what are the parameters? How are we defining it? Like we as the Darien public school system, like how are we doing that? I think that's critical for us to be successful and make sure that our students being successful in whatever capacity we think they can be successful at.
And I think it ties directly to the metrics conversation we'll start having later. And this is one thing, Patrice, that we want to prioritize as a board this year is one of the things I think we run into is then success. How are we defining that? So we are wanting to take a close look, and Greg has kindly offered to be a big lead in that. How are we using metrics? Although I'm happy to say a lot of you others have skills there too. Thank you. So that we can be clear together on what we mean by student achievement. So I think in this, I do think it's true. While we have a lot of documentation, there is a next step with more language and more measurement that hopefully gets us a little closer to a common definition. Robin?
There was just another point I wanted to make on vision and the number 5. The board expresses in the vision mission, the belief that high quality instruction in every classroom is the foundation for high achievement for all students. And I was having trouble tying that back again also to our mission and vision statements as a public school district, because I do agree with this statement. I believe that high quality instruction in every classroom is a foundation, and I didn't necessarily see that tied into our mission and vision statement as a school district. And maybe it's so much more high level that it's not really kind of captured, but this self-evaluation form is making us put numeric values next to it. And from that standpoint, it was very hard to me to say that we were really doing a good job there, because I don't think that we're necessarily tying that back. And again, I'm newer to this, but I think it would be helpful to have a little bit more, maybe a little discussion about that too, because that's a critical piece of what we do.
Alan is definitely going to punch me, but I do think there's some weakness in how we've articulated our mission, because the vision, I think, is very strong and it sets a path for us. But our mission is supposed to be how we operationalize it. And I think it's still fairly, and I'm a part of that. So I own that even as I say it. How do you measure some of the things that we've articulated in our vision? So I think not tomorrow, but as we look at our next round of strat planning, I think specifically looking at the mission is worthwhile.
And I'm talking about the correct one, right? It's on the strategic plan.
Yeah.
It's the,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. Sorry, Alan.
No, I mean, it's a fair comment, it's a fair discussion. I happen to, collectively, that was a community document that was developed just some years ago, not that long ago, really, realistically. I'm actually very proud of the mission statement that encompasses a spirit of learning. The purpose of the public schools is for our students to learn, right? That's
right.
For some reason, sometimes there's even educators sort of like don't even mention that, right? But even in there is an inspiration for our students to learn and to inspire them to learn. Yes, that's the fundamental purpose, and to participate in a democratic environment, right? That's what we want them to be, civic leaders, and go. You don't do that without student achievement, and you don't achieve if you don't have students who are learning. I'm actually, yes, you mentioned it to me, so I think there's a lot of correlation and alignment around the mission, actually, and around the vision. But I'll continue that discussion at another point in time. But I do think the mission does talk about that inspiration of learning right out the box.
Yes.
There was a lot of time spent on that, purposeful time spent on that. Doesn't mean to say whenever I would suggest to the board, if it was leaning towards changing something in the strategic plan, we're another year out from the final year. That may well be the natural time to look at those things closer if you want to do that. But I would say if we were changing, I'm not saying, Madam Chair, that you're suggesting that, people are going to be confused as to what we would be doing, why we would be doing
I think
that.
it should, I'm interrupting you. I think if we look at the mission, it should be part of a larger contextual discussion. I wouldn't recommend pulling that out of, but I think that's, if as board members think about how we articulate on what we measure, I think thinking about the mission and then the components of the strat plan and being prepared for that discussion in a year's time is valuable.
All right, ready to move on to community leadership. Now, you had identified, I would say, many of the elements contained in community leadership, because a lot of them have to do with communication, as one of your goals in your strategic work, goal number 4. which is to enhance engagement and communication between the community, the board, and the district administration. So this is definitely an area where it looks like there's the opportunity for ongoing work, and that's true of board goals in every district in the state. Many goals are not things that you accomplish in 1 year and set aside and then move on. You know, if you need to update the 3,000 section of the policy manual and that's a goal, that might be a 1-year project. And next year you do the 4,000 series. But this is something that you as board members, your connection to the community, your ability to articulate to community members, whether that be organized groups within the community or community members that you're standing next to at a sports event, your ability to articulate the vision, the mission, what it is that the schools in Darien stand for and what they're trying to achieve for students is an ambassador role that you have. And that's different from press releases and newsletters and things like that, all of which are also very important and have their place. But your understanding and embracing those elements make you the most effective ambassador. So when we look at some of the specifics, it begins with communicating and interpreting the vision and mission. Working to promote the accomplishments of the district within the community at large. Again, that's very much an ambassador role. People always, the rumor mill always generates the worst story. It's not just in schools, it's everywhere else. The good stories don't somehow get caught up in the rumor mill and get disseminated as broadly. So your ability to talk about the good things that are happening, whether that be winning a state championship or a robotics team success, or the drama performance that you saw at the end of the school year, talking about that, even with people that may never have been to a high school arts performance, that helps them better understand as citizens in the community why education is so important and what is being accomplished in your schools. I would, there are a couple here collaborating with other school boards to inform state, federal, and local policymakers of concerns related to public education. You rate yourselves, I think you're a little hard on yourselves here. Having Jill representing you at the state level on our board of directors is an important piece of advocacy, having your voice at that table where the positions of the association that represent all boards in the state, I think is very valuable. Do I wish that all board members and all boards were more engaged in advocacy? Of course, that's part of my professional life for my entire career. But I recognize the realities of that. Your concerns begin locally, recognizing what's happening at the state and federal level, and particularly at the state level, how that impacts you as a board, and collaborating with like-minded board members can make a difference. It does influence legislators. So that could be a sub-goal, if I dare suggest that, in the coming year, to identify one or more issues and really reach out to your legislators and have that discussion. Because when CABE can do that work on behalf of all boards, but when legislators hear from their local board members, that resonates with them because they're elected by the same people that elected you. And that makes a difference. So it's not being political, it's influencing the legislative process that exists.
John?
So I went to the first legislative breakfast. When was that? Late in the year last year or earlier this year?
January? When were the legislative breakfasts?
Would have been in January because it was a short session.
So it's what, like fifth year. It was my first breakfast. It was probably one of the best things I attended because the interactions between, and what, Robin was there, you were there. I don't know if anybody else, Sarah was there. So I highly encourage you the opportunity to participate in those. And we hosted it at Oxbridge. It was kind of neat to show that facility off, but the broad spectrum of districts that was there and to hear their perspectives. I mean, guys, listening to the Bridgeport board members talk about how some of these legislative impacts, their budget is really moving relative to how great we have it here, despite our budget friction this past year. Two, to watch the superintendents in action. And in this case, around the literacy and right to read legislation was awesome to hear their expertise and their perspectives and talking a unified voice. And then, I mean, this is going to be critical on the legislators, but to understand, like, even the person who forwarded some of the legislation, I'm not talking about right to read now, but on another, didn't really impact the domino effect it had on some of these districts and the mathematics around budgeting around this. And it was really eye-opening. So I don't know, sorry for the long rant on this, but it was a great opportunity to get in front of these three constituencies in a close room setting and really understand the issues and how things operate and how they don't operate up in Hartford. So I don't know, I'll leave it there, but try to get to the next one.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with that. There was also a CES practice that Alan and I attended, which is also a collection of local legislatures who use CES. Excuse me. And there was a collection of districts who use CES, and legislators are invited to that breakfast.
I'll just say one other thing. The fact that we hosted it was great because Jill acted as MC basically. I was able to kind of point the discussion, and again, a lot of it was around right to read, which was very timely.
To make sure we heard from superintendents. Yeah.
Well, first, I totally agree with John. That was a really excellent kind of opportunity. And also for me as a new kind of a board member to hear and understand a lot of the problem solving that other districts had done as well for certain issues. And it was just a fascinating opportunity to kind of get a lot of great feedback and also to listen and to hear the legislators. But I actually had a comment on a separate issue related to item number 8, the first one, about whether we listen and incorporate appropriate community perspectives into board actions. And I know we have lots of public comment about various issues at any given point during the year. Unfortunately, because of our agenda and how slowly a lot of things move, because we have a very packed agenda during the course of the year, it is a little frustrating even from a board member's perspective, I think, because it's difficult for us to actually make change and make things happen that the public might have really strong feelings about on something that might be a really, really important kind of an issue. And I mean, I'd like to think that we could do better on this. We're doing, I think, what we can, and we're trying to listen and we're trying to put things on the agenda, but it might be 6 months down the road. And so I don't know the best way to kind of handle that, because we have so many things that we have to work on. But I do feel from a public perspective of a very engaged community of parents that there's probably frustration in some levels, and rightly so, I think, because they say, well, we've been talking about this and advocating this for so long and like nothing happens. And so I think as a board, I would love to see maybe somehow so that we could actually improve in that area. And I'm not sure of the best way to do that, but I think we don't have to get everything perfect the first time. And I think there might be slower level of change sometimes because we try to get everything perfect on the first time, and that draws out the entire process, as opposed to putting something in place and then saying, you know what, we need to tweak this, but we can kind of get something in place quickly and then move on it and improve it. And I think there are areas where maybe we could do that a little bit better.
I think that's a really key point. I do think this is a community that values empirical data, and we tend to feel that we need empirical data and a lot of really tight understanding of what's happening operationally before we'll let go. So I do think that's something we could all contemplate as we're up here at the table. I think I actually, Patrice, think that we're actually pretty strong in terms of our maybe not formal collaboration with other school boards, but I'm on the CAPE calls, I'm on the CAPE board, I'm on the CES board, and we're out there. And I think Alan is very well known amongst the superintendents. Where I do think we actually, and this is what we've been talking about in communications, where I really do think I'd like to see us improve and focus is our local ambassadorship, where we're out talking about in our community so that people are feeling the touch points to us more strongly. And that we're kind of out with a common message, not of perfection and that we do everything perfectly in the school district, but of helping people understand what is being done, why it's being done, and then if there's a need to address it, how people can do that. We can help shepherd that process. That's where I see a need for the board to discuss explicitly how we go about it. Julie.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, maybe we as a board would benefit from hearing more about what happens on those calls or what, we
Okay.
hear about like legislative breakfast, but I
Sure.
don't know that we hear so much about the more kind of de rigueur interactions.
Sure.
And that might benefit.
I think that's true.
Thank you.
Yes, I would agree with that 100%. Katie.
Thank you. I agree with Robin that I think that we are lacking in our responsiveness to the public. We hear things, and I think we can do a better job at being more responsive, and letting people know that we hear from them. There was, in terms of like being available to the community, even I think is something that's really important. And this board has talked about, but we haven't actually moved on. I think that it was out of the communication survey where there was a suggestion about board members holding office hours, which I thought was a wonderful idea. And I thought that was a really great platform to give people that opportunity to kind of bump into you where they don't have to make a public comment on a recorded session or live in front of people. They don't have to send an email that's foiable and that's, in black and white and to be interpreted. I think that giving people those opportunities for conversations and letting them be heard and an opportunity for board members to respond, which is, not something that we typically do in public comment, would be really valuable. So I would really love to see something happen with that. The other thing that I just wanted to say in terms of community leadership and our engagement and advocacy is that, kind of tagging on to what Julie said a little bit, but I think it's really important that we're always thinking as a board collectively and that we're recognizing that there are 9 people and that we're not acting unilaterally. We do not always have a unified board. If we did, things would be a lot easier if everyone was on the same page with the same message. When we do not, and we have someone putting out a position, making a statement, like advocating for things that are not shared by the full board members, I think that it's really important to be thoughtful about how that happens. I don't think that formal statements should be made without board members being aware, without taking a sense to understand, is this even something, maybe not that every board member wants, but certainly at least a majority. I think those are really important positions to understand the difference between, kind of facilitating and speaking on behalf of the board versus the difference of speaking for the board.
So you're referring to the 2 times there was a response to the right to read legislation that Alan and I put out a letter, and then there was a formal response. We put out a statement when we had a situation where, to be very careful with my language, there was a concern about, let me just say this, there was a concern about some content in a classroom. And we put out a formal statement, or I did on behalf of the board. In the first instance, Alan and I co-authored it. My feeling was it was consistent with what I had messaged publicly, and it was fast. In the second instance, I took the time to send it out to the entire board for comment. They're a little bit different in that one was 100% a statement on behalf of the board by myself alone. The right to read was in concert with Alan. What can you speak to how other boards handle that spokesperson role?
Yeah. Generally, and often in board policy, the chairperson and or the superintendent serve as the official spokesperson for the board. And intent of that is that they are the individuals in the best position to speak with one voice on behalf of all the individuals. Sometimes a statement is needed before it is logistically possible to be in touch with the rest of the board. So the board chair and the superintendent would consult and say that this is the position consistent with the discussions, the policies, the decisions the board has made previously, and we're going to release that. In other cases, the statement has to be, this is a matter that, if it's a personnel issue, this is a matter that's being investigated, and we cannot provide any additional comment because it involves district personnel. So when there was the comment about office hours, it somewhat relates to this because, as many of you have heard me say, the public perception of you changes when you get elected to the board. When you speak, no matter whether you're having office hours or you're at the soccer field, your comments are attributed in the minds of the public to the comments of the board. And that's just the reality. And you can put all the disclaimers you want, that this is my personal view, this is whatever, but it's going to be perceived 99% of the time as that's what the board thinks, even if it's an issue the board has never discussed. So I would just urge caution about how you set up those perceptions, but certainly you need the chair and the superintendent to be your spokespeople.
John.
Just make that clear, policy 9220, the chairperson shall serve as the board spokesperson, number 2. And this issue's come up a number of times. So I think it's important to also have a voice representing all constituents. And so when you have a voice, just make the disclaimer that you don't speak for the board. You're one of 9 board members. So that's a good way of kind of delineating that.
In terms of, I see you, Katie, but in terms of a follow-up, I know we have a communications meeting in September. So let's take up that question of board presence in the community, I think immediately in September, and find some mechanisms. Again, I know we'll be looking at the communication plan at that time, so it should be a natural time for that. Okay, Katie, then Greg.
I just wanted to say that I think that I'm really glad that we're doing this. I know that we have to, but I think this is a really important time for us to reflect on things. I would like to see us be able to recognize that different people have different experiences on the board without always seeing it as a gauntlet being thrown down and a debate that needs to be pointed out and something. I am fully aware that the board needs a spokesperson and that we have one. My point, to be clear, is that I think in order for there to be an effective spokesperson for the board, that the person serving in that role, the chairperson, needs to, they have an obligation to understand the feelings of all the board members. They have an obligation to speak and engage with people. And I would hope that they would want to accurately represent the full board and not just take it as an opportunity for a platform. So I just want to be clear that I understand those distinctions, and that I hope that as we continue going through this, that we can have a more fruitful conversation and maybe just listen to hear that other people might experience the board slightly different than we do without the need for constant rebuttal.
Greg?
I was just going to piggyback off of Robin's comments, which I thought were spot on, and just add one add-on for consideration is just as we are making those key decision points, whatever it may be, I think that just making sure that we're tracking how they're going and reassessing those and course correcting as necessary, recalibrating, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. And you, I know we talked about specifically like action items and follow-ups. Are you talking about, and Alan, I think you're adding to our agenda sort of an action item area.
Yeah, just as a reflection of that, yes.
Yes. Did you mean something over and above? I think you mean more than just that component. So.
I mean, like if we make a decision on some key thing and we implement the policy, like actually tracking, how's it going? Like it's now been implemented. Is it going well?
Right.
Is it working as we thought? And then reevaluating, reassessing what we think about and based upon how it's going. We need to course correct sometimes, we recalibrate, tweak, sometimes we don't, but just making sure we're going through that process, I think is important.
Yes, I think it ties again to the metrics discussion and how we define success every time we do something. And then the rate at which at which we follow it through. Okay. Should we keep going?
Yes, I just want to make two observations before we move on. In terms of the frustration of the community with things not changing, that's again, a rather universal frustration. What a suggestion is that perhaps in the chair's report or the superintendent's report, there could be an update as to, an acknowledgement that you're continuing to gather the data on X issue that's been raised, or you're continuing to look at policy changes in this area so that the public is informed that you haven't forgotten about the issue, but good decision-making doesn't occur on the spot in the middle of a meeting. And I just have to applaud John for his comments about legislative breakfast. You touch my heart, and I would challenge those of you that have been to a legislative breakfast, bring a friend next year. That's going to be our theme for Day on the Hill as well. Bring a friend, because we had people last year at our Day on the Hill who said, this was great, and I need to get another board member to come with me. And I thought, great plan. So, board operations.
I would just want to say, actually, that was a good suggestion you just made there about updates. And also, I think most board members know that Patrice did facilitate all the focus groups for communications, which has the background of that feedback that supports this morning.
Good point. Okay.
So board operations. Again, a little just for the most part, you rate yourself as being very effective in this area. Again, of disparity around a couple of different issues, whether you are making decisions based on analysis of relevant and research data, and whether your meetings are efficient, effective, and focused primarily on student achievement, however we define that, and other district priorities. And also whether you conduct a comprehensive orientation for new board members. So does anyone want to comment on how you see those particular aspects of board operations? Or how you think they could be improved?
What was the first one you said? I'm sorry.
14, 15, and 19.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And also you're hard on yourself in that you rate yourselves very low in belonging to, actively supports, and participates in professional organizations. CABE is your professional organization. I see that some of you have been to legislative breakfast. Jill is very involved. So personally, I would give you higher feedback in that area, more positive feedback. Would it be great if you all came to the legislative breakfast and then you could rate yourselves a 5 next year? That's a goal.
Julie, then John.
Thanks. I'll just make a plug on that one. I think part of it is some of us are quite involved and some of us aren't. And it may be that some of us know more about what's going on and some don't. Like I've known at times when new board members come on, maybe they aren't getting the what's happening at CABE emails at first.
Yeah.
But my plug was going to be, I have done some webinars and things with CABE on like areas of particular interest, communications, et cetera. And they can be super helpful. And it's like a Zoom at lunchtime and I highly recommend them.
And they're archived on the CABE website for the most part. So if you couldn't participate at lunchtime, but could key it up at 9 o'clock at night, there's that.
John.
So maybe in fixing that form, you put, for example, CABE, and then I might have given a higher mark. I was thinking broader than just CABE, and so that might have been me. And then just the efficient meetings. I think we're getting better, but it's a slow slog, and I probably, I'm right now causing time. But I think we can probably get a little more efficient, better use of time. And we've had certain policies that have come our way and end of meeting times that, I think we are implementing, or considering implementing. So I think we should continue to work down those roads.
I agree. I think there's a couple things we need to look at. I think it's time. Did you have your hand up?
I have it.
Okay. I think there's finish what I said. There's time on a topic, which I think we can do better on making sure our questions are truly germane to what the topic at hand and how our role on the board. And I think there's also the cadence of topics. And I think I would argue making sure that the community, committee meetings are very robust and that the time is taken there, but then the corresponding board work is very tight. Robin.
Okay, so number 14, not as much on the efficiency of meetings, but the focus primarily on student achievement and other district priorities. Again, this might be kind of my more narrow focus on the, focusing the board meetings on student achievement that, I guess my question is, and I know that we have so many district priorities and some of the more operational kinds of things that have to happen. And I'm thinking, for instance, about curriculum. We're putting things in EduPlanet. We're doing this mapping. We're doing, and so all of that obviously has to happen. And that's a huge time intensive task. But I guess what I would love to see more of is then how we measure how we're doing and how does that tie back to student achievement? Is all the work in the EduPlanet mapping and all of that resulting in something that is improving growth in student achievement? And this does get back to our, adding metrics to the students, to the strategic plan, measuring how we're doing, but kind of the critical piece in my view, where I would love to see more improvement, is how can we tie it back and then to allow us to reassess where it might not be working. And this also gets back to, the focus on high-level teaching and instruction in every classroom. Are we ensuring consistency in the teaching between classes? And then these are kind of finer points, but it gets to kind of how are we measuring our success?
Mm-hmm.
We have so much that we have to do operationally, but I would love to see the board operating maybe at a little bit of a higher level to ensure that, and obviously we trust all of the administrators to get all that operational stuff done, but to allow us to have more of a discussion and actions around, are we achieving the success that we need to? Where are we not achieving that? Where are we not having consistency in teaching in classrooms? Are our department chairs and is our curriculum consistent? Are we transitioning well between middle school and high school? And, all those kind of higher level goals and needs, I think we can improve in that. And that's a big, big lift, but to allow the board as a whole in the public eye to operate at that level to represent the parents and the students at that kind of a high level board role. And, we get so into the nitty gritty details that I think sometimes we lose that bigger picture.
Which I think ties back again to the metrics and measurements. So the better we are at defining what we really want to look at, I think that's where what the work you're describing is, getting it to that, what are we measuring and why, and being at the right level for this board.
Right.
We would expect administration.
And maybe
to do.
getting an update. And I don't know what that update looks like, but that's kind of maybe our quarterly update, having that kind of assessment.
Yep. John.
And again, our policies are fortuitous in that 9120, the board shall concern itself with questions of educational policy and not with administrative details of the district's operations. I think this is going to be a theme when we talk about budgeting and stuff, and we do get down the wormholes way too often in terms of how how they're operating the district and imparting our opinions around the lower level operation versus the higher level policy. And so that's why I was critical there.
Would I'd like to ask if anybody, and then I saw you, Kitty, if anybody be willing to take on maybe one of the newer board members or multiple, the comprehensive orientation. I think there's the CABE orientation, which is really helpful, and ideally new board members can make that happen, but there's what we do in-house. You would? Okay, go ahead, yeah.
So one of the things that I wanted to comment on was I do think that there's room for the orientation, and I so appreciate what CABE does, and I think it's really valuable. I also think that because it's a lot to intake, and there's quite a bit of a learning curve, right? Even for those of us who spent, a decade in the back seats before we came up here, it is different being here. Yeah. So I would like to see it be a bit more of an ongoing support, and to give people time to digest and learn and go. There's been some conversation that we've had via some email things about people sending, I think it was to you, Jill, to share about other sort of like documents and working internal things that we could help with, I think could be really helpful. And because I feel the need to get my gold star from Patrice, when I attended the Cape conference, I saw that on one of the communication boards that were there was a sort of board handbook that really outlined some of those things. And Alan very kindly introduced me to the superintendent who allowed me to take it. And I've been meaning to scan it, but I haven't. So perhaps, Alan, I think that he had also promised us a digital copy if we wanted, which I think would be a great starting point as well to kind of see what are other people doing and making sure that we're threading that needle between providing some operational guidance to our members, but not getting into the policy and those things that already exist. So I think that would be a great exercise. And yes, I would be happy to help with that.
Great.
The second thing that I wanted to say was regarding our efficiency, the efficiency of the meetings and the presentation. And I think this comes back to some communications as well. I almost wonder, sorry, Julie, if that might be another thing that perhaps the communications subcommittee might take up, or if not, then maybe a smaller sort of specific thing. But I think that there might be ways that we can also develop like an internal procedure for some of our presentations that would help streamline our effectiveness, where we can outline some of those roles and responsibilities for our board members, knowing that when you come to the meeting, these are the things that we expect you to already know, and these are the things that we're expecting to use our meeting time for. I think for that to work, we need to clearly communicate that to our presenters as well. So I think that might be another area that kind of rolls into both board member responsibilities and communications and efficiencies. Okay.
If I may, I fully support that. Good point.
Okay. Anything else on this one? Oh, Julie.
You. For the onboarding thing, there's a piece that comes up later in our evaluation, but it talks about board members getting on board with decisions that weren't unanimous. And I think we have to think about that in terms of also decisions that happened before you got here. And as the board, I think we own the responsibility of making sure that people who join us are fully brought up to speed and have a working and thorough enough understanding of things that have been developed and agreed to before they were part of the board. So I think that's important because we do need we can't start over again, obviously, every November when we have new people at the table. So I think that's something we want to take note of. And kind of similar to where you were going, Katie, I was thinking when Robin was talking, I wonder if we need to make a point to more clearly make the connection when we're having discussions. How does this impact the students? Or how does this better serve the parent community? So we can tie that back more, because EduPlanet, I think, for example, meets a lot of those needs. For example, we've had a lot of interest in being able to see what the curriculum looks like in more detail from the community. And that's not necessarily why we've gone with EduPlanet, but I think that's a byproduct of it. So if we've lost track of that, or if we're not pointing that out enough, that's just an example that came to mind. So that might be, and whether that's communications work or board work, we can figure that out, I guess. But that's, I think that would be helpful and kind of go in the direction that you were going, Katie.
Okay. Dennis.
Going back to this orientation part, I mark us poorly on this every year because I don't know how else to do it. To your point, I mean, I sat back there for 10 years. I came on here and I was overwhelmed is too strong, but it was a big transition. And Robin, you've mentioned twice, I think, in this meeting alone that you're a new board member. You've been on the board for a year. It takes time. And I just don't know how to get people up to speed where you feel comfortable until you just are sitting in one of the 9 chairs and doing the work.
Do you ever feel comfortable?
No, I guess.
I do.
But I think it's just our human nature is it's a hard jump, and I don't know how to.
I think
how
it's
to not quantify that where I don't know that I ever would mark that as a 5.
I think that's a really good point that probably should be a part of our orientation discussions, which is you just have to expect that no matter how much you've watched this board before, or a similar board, that the lift is heavy because there's a lot of content and there's a lot of particularities because we're a government entity. Most of us have not worked in government before for a lot of reasons. So I think maybe that's something we can explicitly prepare board members on as they come. Just prepare that it's a, no matter what you've done, it's a little bit more uphill than you think it's going to be. Because I think it's a valid point, Dennis, and a good one. Okay, so I think in terms of time, let's keep moving.
But I have to say, there is ongoing support. We are doing on August 8th, new board member and leadership conference at Water's Edge. It's free. So it's another chance. It won't be the same as the convention. It won't be the same as last December's program. So it's, again, a chance because you have different questions after you've been through the budget process, for example, once. They're not the same questions that you had as a brand new, newly elected board member. So do take advantage of that ongoing support.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think to get up to speed, it definitely wasn't enough to just sit at this table. You know me because I've been at CABE since I started. But also I do a lot of research of other boards and read their policy manuals and read how they structure meetings. And I've had to do a lot of work outside of this board to understand this board.
Okay, board ethics. You rate yourselves fairly high in all aspects of this. There is some variation around two areas. One is honoring the board decisions, even when the vote is not unanimous. And I think Julie did a good job of articulating the need to go back and bring people up to, new board members up to speed about prior decisions and how they were arrived at and the amount of input and thought that most likely went into getting to that decision. And then the other one is number 26, the board does not let politics interfere with district business. There is some variation in your perspectives on that. Not that we're at all in a political season right now. I think this is something that everyone in the country is probably struggling with. We always like to say that at the board table, ideally, board members have left politics aside. We have historically had some boards that after they finish the business of electing a chair, which often is on party lines, not always, they then say, I've forgotten which party is represented by my various colleagues at the board. We realize that does not happen in every community. So can you have some conversation with me about any strategies that you see to help you get to a better place in that area?
Go ahead.
Focus on the kids.
Thank you. Focus on your mission. Focus. If we had more time, I would have begun by going around the table and saying, what caused you to be willing to serve in this volunteer position? So maybe when you break for lunch, that could be a topic of conversation among you. You could go around and particularly every board changes when one or more members change. So you may not know that much about the colleague sitting next to you. But if you can focus, what I've always found is the answers turn out to be very similar, or at least the answers that people are willing to share are very similar. So think about that. And I think you will find that you volunteered to do this for the betterment of the students in Darien.
I'd also just say that I think the more that we can work on our internal communications, the better that we'll all be. The more that we are having conversations with one another, and especially not dividing the, sort of the information sharing along party lines, and even just with the natural conversations we have, I think the more outreach we all do, the easier it will be to work together as like a full board and have,
Okay. All right. Final section. The board superintendent team. And this is something that in our work in governance with boards over the course of many, many years is critical. You have to be a cohesive team because otherwise a lot of time and energy is wasted on things that are not relevant to the welfare of students. So, again, some disparity around how effectively you work with the superintendent as a leadership team. And again, this may be because we refer to high achievement consistently here. That could be I see a nod, and we're definitely going to go back and look at how we articulate student achievement. We know that student achievement is key, but we also know that everyone defines student achievement in different ways. And some districts have many more components in their definition of student achievement than other districts. And the other one is where there was some difference of perspective. The board provides direction to the superintendent as a whole, not from individual board members. I mean, you all know, you went to Board Member Orientation 101, so you all know that you only have power when you come together as a collective body. And that, but again, districts work differently. There are districts where individual board members feel free to call the superintendent and provide direction as an individual. In most cases, the superintendent is able to say, we need to talk about chain of command and how decisions are made and how priorities are set, because that is really the issue. If two board members have a certain project initiative that they feel very strongly about, and they're putting pressure on the superintendent to move on that, if that's not a collective board priority, then other things are going to have to take a back seat because there is only so much time, even in the superintendent's day and week, to get everything done. So do you want to talk about that issue at all?
Good.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is kind of connected or in parallel. I'd like to understand how other boards kind of set agendas, meeting by meeting. Secondly, I think we do a really good job doing master agendas at the board level, but when it comes down to how, setting up the weekly agenda, how do other boards do that in conjunction with the superintendent?
Many boards operate on a model where the board chair and the superintendent develop the agenda. Often the superintendent will put out a draft, the board chair will provide input. In other districts, the quote unquote executive committee, so it might be the board chair, vice chair, and secretary of the board, put that together in conjunction with the superintendent. But it is a collaborative, but it does often begin with, the superintendent knows what the action items are that have to be on the next agenda. Then it's a matter of prioritizing what are the discussion topics that you have that the administration has the information ready for to have a productive discussion, for example.
Perfect. Thank you.
Katie.
Patrice, I appreciate that you mentioned that other boards do have executive committees. We moved to that model recently. And I do think that I've mentioned several times that that I'm not a fan of that model and why. I will say that a big part of why I'm not a fan of it is that it was never collectively decided by the board. And I do think that it creates a situation where you have people kind of that have more access and people that have less outside the role of, that there was like one designated person to be that liaison and that spokesperson. So I would just highlight again that this will continue to be an issue for me until we put it to the board to decide formally that this is what they want to do. And recognizing, like we talked about before, when we don't have unanimous things, if the majority of the board wants it that way, I will shut up about it. But until it's been decided, it feels problematic.
Does anyone else have a comment on that? Against or? Well, let's let everyone, let non-executive, Sarah not here, but let's let non-executive members speak first, I think.
I mean, I guess I'm just looking at it from the perspective of other boards that I've been on, and typically they do have an executive committee, and it would include the chair, the vice chair, and usually the secretary, sometimes even the treasurer. So, and those are extensive, like board kind of roles that I have had in nonprofits and like different organizations, school organizations, et cetera. So to me, it didn't really seem like it was an unusual arrangement. It's not, but this is different potentially because it's an elected body. So.
Okay. All right. Julie?
I will add, as I have said before, that regardless of the structure, if the communication flow is functional and to everyone's satisfaction, I think I'm good with it. I don't know that I think that we have the communication flow as nailed down as it could be with our current leadership team structure. And that's what I struggle with. And I would like to see us formalizing that some to make sure that it doesn't feel so much that there are 6 and 3, which is often the feeling, and 3 that know things that the other 6 don't. So that's, while I understand what Katie's point is that it wasn't chosen, that's another piece, but I'd say my bigger issue is how it's working or not working. And that's my biggest problem with it.
Okay. Dennis?
I think it works well for me. I like the idea and I like the idea of having 3 versus 1. To me, I'm with Robin. I think the executive committee should be tasked to do that. Could the communication flow better? For sure. Just like, I think that was a part of our talk earlier. I think we can always improve our communication. Do we do it perfectly? No. And can we do it better? For sure.
Okay. Greg?
I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I think that any member of the board has been open to receiving a phone call from me available at any time. So I haven't really had issues with communication. I mean, sometimes I don't know exactly what's happening, but I'm not as concerned. I mean, I typically get up to speed pretty quickly. And if there's something that I think is important, I reach out to Jill or John or Edie or Robin or whoever. I don't really have an issue with that.
Okay. John?
This was kind of instituted before I was an officer. We did it because of the lack of information flow and the inability of board members to get things on the agenda and the prior chair at the time. So it wasn't, I guess I was on the board when the decision was made. I'll just leave it at that, the history. I'm biased because I think it's, now I'm an officer. I think it's a great idea to have multiple people in the room with the superintendent. In developing the agenda, so perspectives can be given. And again, we have 3, just to be clear, 3 from both parties if people are worried about politics getting in the agenda writing. So I think that's important as well.
And I didn't want to bring politics into it, but I was going to ask that because that is often the rationale for having a committee, an executive committee work on the agenda, in that you are ensuring that multiple perspectives are represented.
I mean, I'll just go a step further. I think it's really important that there are multiple, again, we're supposed to keep politics out, but it's a reality. And having, at least both parties involved in the officers is critical to a working board.
Yeah, I would say my experience is I'm 100% open to improvement. But I think and I have seen historically, there's always some difficulty in information flow. I think, however, that I've seen instances where there were clearly board members who had no idea what was going on a regular basis. And it was very clear by the questions that were asked that people were left out. I don't think we're at that stage. That doesn't mean that we don't have improvements to make. I do think the executive committee is a very good structure. And then I do think it's more representative. It's more points of view. There are some checks and balances to making sure that what was said at the board table is in fact being interpreted correctly when things, in terms of planning for the agenda, the conversations are pretty clean to just what's on the agenda. And they're actually relatively short. So, having lived under both realities as an officer as secretary, I did not attend the meetings. I found that challenging because then I had to later on figure out what needed a motion, what didn't, and we cleaned that up. But again, having been an officer where that wasn't a model, a board member where that wasn't a model, and then now an officer where that is a model, it is my impression so far that that it works very well. Having attended CABE conversations about and asked explicitly how people run their agenda planning, there are a lot of boards, as far as I could tell, that do the executive committee model. And most people who use it are in favor of it. So I would not be inclined to change it unless it is the will of the majority of the board to do so. So if it is, and Dave, are you there? Forgive me for skipping you. Are you there, Dave?
I'm good. I'm just following along. No comment right now.
No comment on this? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So if it's the will of the majority of the board to go back to a singular, I'm more than happy to do that, but I'd need to hear that I would like to hear that the majority of the board would like that. I'm not hearing it, but
We can put,
do you want to put it on the agenda?
yeah, let's do it.
Okay, we have a master agenda discussion later,
Yeah.
and we can put it on for a formal vote. Okay? All right,
You want to ask the superintendent?
sure. Let's ask the superintendent.
No.
I just thought I'd just give a wee perspective. I've worked under two scenarios, right? And I'll be honest with my experience. 11 prior years before arriving here, and that was always one-on-one. I've worked under the two scenarios here, right? The pros and cons, sometimes I feel it's a wee bit of an imbalance, just literally numbers, right? That being said, I also sometimes feel that it could, under certain situations, impact what I would call a special relationship that the superintendent has with the board chair. And occasionally that might run contrary to the argument, just being able to say what you have to say, right? That being said, it works fine the way it is, right? If you were asking me out the door, like if you asked me all my experience as a 16-year superintendent, I would like to work under the one-to-one. That's not talking about this board. I'm just giving you an honest disposition. Okay. That being said, I respect the situation. It works. And I'm saying it works because it does work. But I'm just trying to go.
Okay. Thank you, Alan.
Alan, I thought you were going to tell the story about meeting the board chair at the YMCA.
No, I think we're done with that. Thank you very much. Okay. I was a different board chair.
Yeah, it's not me. Okay, Patrice, back to you.
I think that we have covered what you set out, and I think we've done it in the appropriate time frame.
Okay.
Are there things that I can provide you as a follow-up?
Well, I actually would say if we have 12 minutes, which it looks like we do.
Yeah.
One of the things we spent a part of, I think, why we couldn't focus as much on communications as we might have liked to in the spring is that we were consumed by our budget through May. And I think there are a number of topics about the budget that people probably have top of mind. I think on my own list are three things: the use of appropriations, how we give direction to the superintendent in a public manner, and our interaction with the fiscal authority. So I would put on the table that if we want to, we're talking about budget, but more from a content perspective in a little bit. But if we want to talk more philosophically about how we actually work operationally, I would argue we can do some of that now. Yes, Alan.
I just wanted to mention before we moved off that, sorry. I think the board has undercut some of their sort of feedback a little bit, particularly under 32 chain of command. And respecting that and through the proper chain of command. I think the board has grown significantly in that area and what I would say a very positive direction. So I just wanted to say that, that's all.
Okay, thank you. I think that's probably related to the budget discussion in terms of how we give direction to the superintendent. We were kind of 9 of us going in 9 different directions.
Sorry, Jill, what was the third piece that you mentioned? Was it initiatives?
It was how we give direction to the superintendent. It was appropriations and our interaction with the Board of Finance.
Can you say that again? Interaction with
the Board of Finance.
Fiscal
Authority, yes. I think all three of those merit some. Now, I will say, I think we probably should just want to put some stuff on the table as opposed to using 12 minutes to redesign our budget process. So what we did last year was identify a couple of areas that needed further exploration. We sent it to the finance committee for them to take a look at the process, beat it up a little bit more, and then they brought it back to the board with some proposals. I would suggest that's probably a better use of time because I don't think we'll be able to deconstruct months of budgeting in what's now 11 minutes, but that's my suggestion. I think the other piece I would say, not so much as a third point, but as an overarching philosophical theme is, is making sure that the board is at the right level of problem solving. I think we have some work there, like setting direction early on, following that through, but staying at a pretty high level in terms of how we give direction. And that's, anyway, I'll stop talking. Would anybody like to comment, John?
Well, I mean, we have an agenda item later, right? On this.
We do, but I don't think we're going through the budget process. We'll end up touching on the process, but we're really talking about content of the budget.
Okay,
right?
so maybe if I can reflect on this budget season, one of the difficulties is the fiscal authority. We had our discussions and came to a Board of Education approved budget, and the fiscal authority came in and the RTM supported that with a reduction of increase. If in a perfect world, you could wave a magic wand, it would have been nice to kind of understand where the fiscal authority, what the Board of Finance was, so that we didn't drag ourselves and the administration and the community into getting to that final number. So and we have a very diversified Old English style government here, right? So maybe you could help us in understanding processes that maybe exist in our style of government that might differ from.
So I can cue that up a little bit. So I think a couple of pieces are one, how boards work with their fellow government bodies, through the process. I know there are some boards who actually do a lot more upfront work and provide some forecasting and actually do some pre-planning or pre-problem solving early on. Some cases try board meetings, other cases just dual Board of Finance, Board of Ed meetings. And then, so I think that's the first piece. Second piece is, and Rich, I know you have some perspective on this too, is what people coming out of either of those meetings or the fiscal authority, there often is some sort of guidance. I don't know what it's called in all districts. How that's typically handled would be helpful. And then I think the third question I would say in terms of how other boards handle things is you get to a point where you need to say to the superintendent, all right, you need to cut XYZ. How do boards typically give that direction? We've been doing a very bottom-up process where we cut anything as little as breads and ice machines to larger scale items like, either large numbers or entire initiatives.
So clearly,
sorry,
attempting a dialogue with local fiscal authorities is very important. Boards will meet with varied success on that issue. Some reach out and their local fiscal authority will never agree to have a discussion. In some communities, the Board of Ed chair and the chair of the fiscal authority meet one-on-one and have a conversation about what are the expectations for the upcoming year. Understanding what the perspective of the fiscal authority is important. It's also very important to convey to the fiscal authority what the priorities of the board are, why bringing them in early and understanding why these initiatives, which will cost money, are important to the success of the Darien Public Schools, won't necessarily mean that they vote for the budget that the board proposes, but it starts to build that understanding so it doesn't come to them out of the blue. Now, if the fiscal authority provides guidance, as they have in some communities, that we want a 0% increase, you as Board of Education members have to reflect upon the fact that you are the advocates for the public schools in Darien. There is no other governmental body that has that responsibility. So you can take that input and reflect upon it. But when you come to proposing a budget, you're going to need to do what's best for the students. There's the whole communication piece of making sure the community understands what the priorities are and why this is so important. Working with, real estate is often something that does resonate with people of whether they have children in the schools or not. Their property values matter to them, and a outstanding public school system definitely impacts property values. And a school system that is not supported by taxpayers also impacts property values in the other direction. So I do think that having that communication, and it can be difficult, it can be challenging, but doing it early matters.
And I think that's going to be our intention. Julie, then Katie.
So from there, I think probably one of my biggest frustrations with this budget season was how early on we knew that we were never going to be where we were told to be. And on we went, and there they stayed, and never did the two things come together. And even after the cut, we never got there.
Can you just, sorry, I didn't understand, never.
Sorry, so the direction we were given when the Board of Finance gave their guidance, we knew from a presentation we'd had 2 months earlier that we didn't have a chance of ever getting to that place. Now, could we have come in closer? And maybe, but we were never going to get there. So I guess I wonder, what could we or should we have done differently? Because it felt a little like then we just kept banging our head against the wall a little bit, to be blunt.
Again, that's going to be a strategic decision. If there is a hope of changing minds, and again, if you start the discussion early with building on, here are the anticipated needs, and here's why these are such priorities for our students, for the children of Darien. Sometimes you do have to keep banging your head against the wall. I do want to, I failed to respond to Jill's question of what direction you give around cuts. The board should give direction to the administration of because of what has happened and the direction, the decision of the fiscal authority, we need you to cut X number of dollars. The administration then goes back and does the work of figuring out what are the small things that we can adjust. What's the new information about insurance costs? Maybe it's come in lower than we anticipated. And then what's a big strategic initiative that we're going to have to recommend that we not fund? That should be administration work, not board work.
Katie, and then Greg.
So I would say that, specific to the budget, I'm going to speak a little more in generalities than just in this year. I think from a philosophical standpoint, I feel strongly that I want to see the superintendent develop a budget that is based on student need, that is not backing into a number. And I would like to see the board approach it that way as well. I understand that the Board of Finance is coming from a very different perspective, but I think our responsibility is to provide for educational needs. And then I would say that I think, Patrice, your point about priorities is well taken. I think that could help a lot with the board and the administration being on the same page. When we know what our top priorities are, then we know where we don't want to cut, where we don't want to go into. If that is established and we're on the same page, I think that will help a lot with us avoiding maybe some of that back and forth in small and different directions. And then lastly, I just wanted to comment, Jill, on your conversation, the points that you highlighted about appropriations, directions, and interactions, all of those things. I would say that my general sentiment on all of that is consistency. That I think that having a protocol, a procedure, a process in place that is followed with fidelity and consistency is what is best for the board. when we, sort of alter the process because of this situation and that situation, it can feel not just to the board, but to the public and to other places that things are being manipulated for outcomes. So I would just say that again, when we're following the same process year after year and in scenario after scenario, there's a lot less room for discontent in the outcome.
Can you be a little more specific? Because I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I would just say, I mean that in a general sense. I think that that's an important responsibility of the board is to be consistent. I think whether it's communication, whether it's appropriations, whether it's our relations with the other boards, having a consistent process will keep everything of high integrity.
Well, I think building on that point, I think one of the things that we experienced this year as townwide, not just as a board, was the level of the financial discussions we had to have put a lot of pressure on our existing processes. And so there are some areas where there are clear gaps. So for example, the fact that the board was taking it upon itself and has for many, many, many years to cut and, cultural breads was, I think, showed up with a lot of flaws this year. So I think we functioned much better when we gave the direction to the superintendent and his team to go figure it out and then come back to us with a proposal that then we could respond to. And we have a couple of examples of doing that this year and in previous years. So I think it's incumbent upon us to take some time to discuss what we want our process to look like going forward this year. And we're starting that conversation today, right? Starting with some priorities, identifying what that means fiscally, talking about the budgetary context. We actually started that in June. We haven't ever done that kind of discussion at this timeframe before. I think, Rich, when we talk about the forecast a little later, I'd love to talk to you about there's some gaps in what we can forecast today, but what would a real cadence of forecasting look like? And when would be the best time to go to the Board of Finance so that, and what is the information we want to provide to them? Not that we have to answer all that today, but let's talk about that forecasting process. Greg, I'm hoping you'll get us up, be a big part of that discussion going forward. What's the forecast we want to create? What's the cadence? And then getting it communicated to the Board of Finance in a timely manner, way before the state of the town. They did discuss their process briefly. I watched their meeting last week. They talked about using a public process to develop it together, what data they would like the boards to provide and the correct timeline, also taking a look at capital prioritization. There was a question that they were discussing amongst themselves about how we would use the guidance at the end of the day. If they produce guidance, I think it's up to us to determine how we use it. But I would say, in the interest of transparency and good work, I'd rather know where the Board of Finance is in space than have no idea and find out, when they cut our budget. So I do support the idea of the Board of Finance going through some sort of exercise, but I think that it's incumbent on us to provide them the best information we can. And we haven't been doing that either. So I think there was an old process in place that we cut out a few years ago. Rich, you were here for that because it was just a meaningless forecast. So we stopped doing it and we weren't giving it to them formally anyway. So some thoughts, but anyway, Julie, go ahead.
Just to add to that, just to say it out loud, I do think it would be very helpful to be able to follow a conversation that the Board of Finance has about how they arrive at that number, because that was very, very missing this year.
Okay, Dave's hand is raised and then Greg.
Thanks. So Jill, just following up to that conversation, it was mentioned earlier about some of the delays and how long this took with our usual process of doing ad cut after we received the budget. It was also noted that we had received the guidance from Board of Finance significantly earlier. I guess my question, Patrice, can you talk a little bit about other boards of ed and how the interplay works between the superintendent and the board? Because from my perspective as a board member, until I actually get the superintendent's proposed budget, there's no action I can take. And then we followed our traditional route. The problem was, however, the guidance we already received was not baked into the superintendent's initial budget. So how do we move the levers up front to perhaps avoid that disconnect? Because just given the way that gap was created and that gap existed, it made it very difficult for us to expedite working forward to get a resolution to a number that was our target. So how do boards prepare better so as to that sort of scenario with the superintendent?
David, I had a little trouble hearing you, so I'm going to try and answer. And if I've missed something, just come back and I'll try again.
Yeah, I mean, the short question is, how do we get upfront, the first cut of the superintendent is going to reflect all the present information, such as the guidance from the Board of Finance, and what are best practices around that happening?
That does vary among communities in terms of when the Board of Finance is willing to provide that guidance. And also it depends upon what that guidance looks like. As I said, if the message is that as it has been in some communities, the initial message from the fiscal body is 0% all departments, that's not where you're going to tell your superintendent to bring in a budget. You're going to tell the superintendent, here are some priorities. Here's a new initiative that we feel is critical. We want you to cost it out. Is there anything that we can recommend that we no longer need to fund, that its effectiveness has served its useful life? So that, it's both sides of budgeting, but there's not a magic date, number one. And number two, it does go back to the communication of the board to the superintendent as to what the priorities are.
Greg, then Julie, then John.
Yeah, just based on the comments, it sounds like other districts don't do this process where it's like individual line items. So it's more like big subject matters that they're giving feedback on to the superintendent. I'm just interested in like, if we're like understanding how we're going to do that, I think is going to be really important because, this was my first budget process as a board member. And I was very frustrated by the line item thing because we're making cuts in front of people who are right there, which is awkward.
Yeah.
And so I think that like, there's a lot more upfront work that has to be done in order to be able to do that, and more communication from the superintendent on like, here are going to be the big things that are going to move the needle on this, because I don't think our budget this year was really driven by, we have these 5 giant new initiatives that we're putting in place. It was driven by other things that were just ordinary course inflationary type stuff. And so it wasn't driven by stuff that you're thinking where it's like, we can just say, hey, don't do this, don't do that. It was a totally different type of conversation. And so understanding how other boards manage through that, I think would be helpful.
And I can do some work on that too. There's a CABE listserv, so I'm happy to send out some questions on behalf of the board. How do you, there's some from last year, there was a whole conversation last year, but I can send some questions and just harvest some data from other board chairs. Somebody just remind me that so I don't walk out and not do it. Julie.
Thank you. I guess kind of going back to what I was saying before, just to be clear, I myself would not be looking for the superintendent to bring us a budget that meets the guidance from the fiscal authority in town when he brings us his first budget. It is my expectation and belief that our superintendent will bring us a responsible and reasonable, financially responsible and reasonable budget, but I think that it should include all the things that he believes would deliver the appropriate and best educational experience for the kids for the coming year. So when I was saying that disconnect was an ongoing frustration, I think it felt more to me like it should have been addressed head on, that those things weren't going to ever come to the same place. So how can we work through that instead of, we heard a lot, well, I wanted it to start with the 3. Well, it's not going to start, it was just sort of, that was the stalemate, but I just wanted to make sure it was clear that I do not expect Dr. Adley to bring us a budget that comes to a particular number as provided by the Board of Finance when we start this process.
John.
So to agree with Katie, I do think there's philosophical differences. And so I think the board at some point is going to have to come to a consensus, and it's going to probably change based on its membership each year of whether or not we encourage the superintendent to understand the broader fiscal implications of the town, so we don't every year run into a brick wall and have to do basically a second budget process. Because not only do we find it frustrating, and some said tiring, but the amount of work that then we task with these individuals at the table is insurmountable, but it's very difficult. And that takes away from everything we're trying to achieve in creating a budget for our students and our community. So I think these are some of the things we're going to have to work out. Certainly not going to do it at 12 o'clock today, but some of the discussion points that I look forward to kind of figuring out.
Robin.
I mean, I'm kind of going back to, I'd love to know how other towns do this, because I had always thought in all of the 12 years that I've been involved in some extent with CDSP, with the budget process for the Board of Ed, that the superintendent comes up with the budget based on the educational needs of the town, and that we were not necessarily tied to a specific number that the Board of Finance comes up with a month ahead of that time. So in my experience on this, it was sort of a surprise that for the first time, even though we have all of these exorbitant rising fixed costs that we have no control over, which also happen to every other district in the state of Connecticut, that we were still held to a certain percentage increase because that happened to be what the average over the past 5 years was, which in many ways didn't necessarily apply this year or even for next year based on the fixed cost kinds of increase and the constraints that we're facing. So my question is, first of all, with the Board of Finance, is their process going forward going to involve a much heavier lift on their part about actually understanding all of the factors that the Board of Education is dealing with? Because to some extent, that creates their own process before the superintendent has even introduced the details of what he's facing, which to me seems backwards. So I'm kind of having I understand that they need to set taxes. They want to have some kind of a guidance for being able to do that in a fiscally responsible manner. But first of all, I'd love to see the Board of Finance having their entire body constructively and together kind of coming up with what is that number, as opposed to, because I think based on their feedback, they never actually had a discussion and they did not have a vote prior to coming up to what the number is. So that's one thing. And I don't know how they talked about that or if they're going to change their process. But to me, again, because our responsibility is to come up with what is in the best interest of the students and the schools, I still think that that is our responsibility. And as a Board of Ed, and the superintendent, we need to kind of figure out what is the best interest. And that might be a little bit above what the Board of Finance might want to happen. And I'm new at this, at being in this seat. And so I understand that there are political ramifications, there are fiscal issues. And I guess I'm struggling because having those two being so far apart, when you're dealing with changing economic times, changing factors that are outside of our control, it makes it extremely difficult if we really are in fact expected to come to that number, whatever it was.
I think, Robin, if I could jump in, I think there's a difference. Look, the Board of Finance is going to hold us to what they hold us to, but I think it is helpful, and we don't have a lot of control over that other than a lot of advocacy, starting now and going through the process. At the end of the day, they have three levers. They have the tax rate, they have bonding, they have reserve funds. And so they should create some sort of fiscal strategy together that represents what's available. And that helps inform the guidance. I do think we should be doing some robust forecasting, both on the capital and the operating, so that they can see where we're coming from. Then they give us the guidance. What we do with it is entirely up to us. If they give us a guidance, we're not going to get a 0%, but let's say we get a 2.5, a 3.5. And, Alan may or may not be able to bring in a budget at that number. There have been years when we certainly could come in with those numbers. It's not looking like this year is one, but, to be determined. So then I think the question to us is, how do we handle it? But I would rather understand where the Board of Finance's head is, not because it's a directive that we have to hit XYZ. We may end up having to hit it if our budget is reduced, but because I think it would also be a mistake to have no idea where they are in space.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. We want to know where their head is. But I guess when Rich did what I thought was a pretty good job doing an initial forecast of hero drivers that we know about right now, and he gave that to us, I think, in October, it didn't seem to me that the Board of Finance guidance that we got in December necessarily took into account that initial forecast of what the headwinds were that we were already facing.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, in the interest of time, we probably just need to wrap this one up. You know, we can't control that board. I think what we can do is make sure that the information that it gets to them is as good as possible. Ask them to go through a public process, and ideally one that's fairly collaborative. And I think those are the things that we can take on, and then make sure our advocacy is as tight as possible all the way through.
And continue to increase our forecasting abilities so we have a little bit more of that information in the fall.
Yes.
Would be really helpful too. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll just say that the baked in analysis that we did last year was the first time ever that we've tasked, I think, right, the administration to give us a early picture. And so now we'll build on that. And I think you hit on it and you both hit on it, collaborating with the Board of Finance earlier on and, you know, pulling this into maybe a joint meeting. So it's front and center within the community. I think that's the next step in this process.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Patrice, thank you so very much.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
I wish you a productive rest of the day.
Thank you. All right, we are about 15 minutes behind, but we'll take our 15-minute break to get lunch. So I'll take a motion to recess. That is Greg, seconded by Dennis. All those in favor?
Aye.
And we will meet back here. That's unanimous. Thank you. We'll meet back here at 12:30.